Section 14 of American Notes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rick Cornwall. American Notes by Charles Dickens. Chapter 12. Leaving Cincinnati at 11 o'clock in the forenoon, we embarked for Louisville in the Pike steamboat, which, carrying the mails, was a packet of a much better class than that in which we had come from Pittsburgh. As this passage does not occupy more than 12 or 13 hours, we arranged to go ashore that night, not coveting the distinction of sleeping in a stateroom, when it was possible to sleep anywhere else. There chanced to be on board this boat, in addition to the usual dreary crowd of passengers, one Pitchlynn, a chief of the Choctaw tribes of Indians, who sent in his card to me, and with whom I had the pleasure of a long conversation. He spoke English perfectly well, though he had not begun to learn the language, he told me, until he was a young man grown. He had read many books, and Scott's poetry appeared to have left a strong impression on his mind, especially the opening of The Lady of the Lake, and the great battle scene in Marmion, in which, no doubt, from the congeniality of the subject to his own pursuits and tastes, he had great interest and delight. He appeared to understand correctly all he had read, and whatever fiction had enlisted his sympathy in its belief, had done so keenly and earnestly. I might almost say fiercely. He was dressed in our ordinary everyday costume, which hung about his fine figure loosely and with indifferent grace. On my telling him that I regretted not to see him in his own attire, he threw up his right arm for a moment, as though he were brandishing some heavy weapon, and answered, as he let it fall again, that his race were losing many things besides their dress, and would soon be seen upon the earth no more. But he wore it at home, he added proudly. He told me that he had been away from his home west of the Mississippi 17 months, and was now returning. He had been chiefly at Washington on some negotiations pending between his tribe and the government, which were not settled yet, he said, in a melancholy way, and he feared never would be. For what could a few poor Indians do against such well-skilled men of business as the whites? He had no love for Washington, tired of towns and cities very soon, and longed for the forest and the prairie. I asked him what he thought of Congress, and he answered with a smile that it wanted dignity in an Indian's eyes. He would very much like, he said, to see England before he died, and spoke with much interest about the great things to be seen there. When I told him of that chamber in the British Museum wherein are preserved household memorials of a race that ceased to be, thousands of years ago, he was very attentive, and it was not hard to see that he had a reference in his mind to the gradual fading away of his own people. This led to speak of Mr. Catlin's gallery, which he praised highly, observing that his own portrait was among the collection, and that all the likenesses were elegant. Mr. Cooper, he said, had painted the red man well, and so would I, he knew, if I could go home with him and hunt buffaloes, which he was quite anxious I should do. When I told him that, supposing I went, I should not be very likely to damage the buffaloes much, he took it as a great joke, and laughed heartily. He was a remarkably handsome man, some years past 40, I should judge, with long black hair, an aquiline nose, broad cheekbones, a sunburnt complexion, and a very bright, keen, dark, and piercing eye. There were but 20,000 of the Choctaws left, he said, and their number was decreasing every day. A few of his brother chiefs had been obliged to become civilized, and to make themselves acquainted with what the whites knew, for it was their only chance of existence. But there were not many, and the rest were as they always had been. He dwelt on this, and said several times that unless they tried to assimilate themselves to their conquerors, they must be swept away before the strides of civilized society. When we shook hands at parting, I told him he must come to England, as he longed to see the land so much, that I should hope to see him there one day, and that I could promise him he would be well received and kindly treated. He was evidently pleased by this assurance, though he rejoined with a good-humoured smile and an arch shake of his head that the English used to be very fond of the red men when they wanted their help, but had not cared much for them since. He took his leave, as stately and complete a gentleman of nature's making as ever I beheld, and moved among the people in the boat, another kind of being. He sent me a lithographed portrait of himself soon afterwards, very like, though scarcely handsome enough, which I have carefully preserved in memory of our brief acquaintance. There was nothing very interesting in the scenery of this day's journey, which brought us at midnight to Louisville. We slept at the Galt House, a splendid hotel, and were as handsomely lodged as though we had been in Paris, rather than hundreds of miles beyond the Alleghanies. The city presenting no objects of sufficient interest to detain us on our way, we resolved to proceed next day by another steamboat, the Fulton, and to join it about noon at a suburb called Portland, where it would be delayed some time in passing through a canal. The interval after breakfast we devoted to riding through the town, which is regular and cheerful, the streets being laid out at right angles and planted with young trees. The buildings are smoky and blackened from the use of bituminous coal, but an Englishman is well used to that appearance, and indisposed to quarrel with it. There did not appear to be much business stirring, and some unfinished buildings and improvements seemed to intimate that the city had been overbuilt in the ardour of going ahead, and was suffering under the reaction consequent upon such feverish forcing of its powers. On our way to Portland, we passed a magistrate's office, which amused me, as looking far more like a dame's school than any police establishment, for this awful institution was nothing but a little lazy, good-for-nothing front parlour open to the street, wherein 2 or 3 figures, I presume the magistrate and his myrmidons, were basking in the sunshine, the very effigies of languor and repose. It was a perfect picture of Justice retired from business for want of customers, her sword and scales sold off, napping comfortably with her legs upon the table. Here, as elsewhere in these parts, the road was perfectly alive with pigs of all ages, lying about in every direction fast asleep, or grunting along in quest of hidden dainties. I had always a sneaking kindness for these odd animals, and found a constant source of amusement, when all others failed, in watching their proceedings. As we were riding along this morning, I observed a little incident between 2 youthful pigs, which was so very human as to be inexpressibly comical and grotesque at the same time, though I dare say in telling it is tame enough. One young gentleman, a very delicate porker with several straws sticking about his nose, betokening recent investigations in a dunghill, was walking deliberately on, profoundly thinking, when suddenly his brother, who was lying in a miry hole unseen by him, rose up immediately before his startled eyes, ghostly with damp mud. Never was pig's whole mass of blood so turned. He started back at least 3 feet, gazed for a moment, and then shot off as hard as he could go, his excessively little tail vibrating with speed and terror like a distracted pendulum. But before he had gone very far, he began to reason with himself as to the nature of this frightful appearance, and as he reasoned, he relaxed his speed by gradual degrees, until at last he stopped, and faced about. There was his brother, with the mud upon him glazing in the sun, yet staring out of the very same hole, perfectly amazed at his proceedings. He was no longer assured of this, and he assured himself so carefully that one may almost say he shaded his eyes with his hands to see the better. Then he came back at a round trot, pounced upon him, and summarily took off a piece of his tail, as a caution to him to be careful about what he was about for the future, and never to play tricks with his family any more. We found the steamboat in the canal, waiting for the slow process of getting through the lock, and went on board, where we shortly afterwards had a new kind of visitor in the person of a certain Kentucky giant, whose name is Porter, and who is of the moderate height of 7 foot 8 inches in his stockings. There never was a race of people who so completely gave the lie to history as these giants, or upon whom all the chroniclers have so cruelly libelled. Instead of roaring and ravaging about the world, constantly catering for their cannibal larders, and perpetually going to market in an unlawful manner, they are the meekest people in any man's acquaintance, rather inclining to milk and vegetable diet, and bearing anything for a quiet life. So decidedly are amiability and mildness their characteristics, that I confess I look upon that youth who distinguished himself by the slaughter of these inoffensive persons, as a false-hearted brigand, who, pretending to philanthropic motives, was secretly influenced only by the wealth stored up within their castles, and the hope of plunder. And I lean the more to his opinion from finding that even the historian of these exploits with all his partiality for his hero, is fain to admit that the slaughtered monsters in question were of an innocent and simple turn, extremely guileless and ready of belief, lending a credulous ear to the most improbable tales, suffering themselves to be easily entrapped into pits, and even, as in the case of the Welsh giant, with an excess of the hospitable politeness of a landlord, ripping themselves open, rather than hint at the possibility of their guests being versed in the vagabond arts of sleight of hand and hocus pocus. The Kentucky giant was but another illustration of the truth of this position. He had a weakness in the region of the knees, and a trustfulness in his long face, which appealed even to the 5'9" for encouragement and support. He was only 25 years old, he said, and had grown recently, for it had been found necessary to make an addition to the legs of his inexpressibles. At 15 he was a short boy, and in those days his English father and his Irish mother had rather snubbed him as being too small of stature to sustain the credit of the family. He added that his health had not been good, though it was better now, but short people are not wanting who whisper that he drinks too hard. I understand he drives a hackney coach, though how he does it, unless he stands on the footboard behind, and lies along the roof upon his chest with his chin in the box, it would be difficult to comprehend. He brought his gun with him as a curiosity. Christened the little rifle, and displayed outside a shop window, it would make the fortune of any retail business in Holborn. When he had shown himself and talked a little while, he withdrew with his pocket instrument, and went bobbing down the cabin, among men of 6 feet high and upwards, like a lighthouse walking among lamp posts. Within a few minutes afterwards we were out of the canal, and in the Ohio River again. The arrangements of the boat were like those of the Messenger, and the passengers were of the same order of people. We fed at the same times, on the same kind of viands, in the same dull manner, and with the same observances. The company appeared to be very oppressed by the same tremendous concealments, and had as little capacity of enjoyment or light-heartedness. I never in my life did see such listless, heavy dullness as brooded over these meals. The very recollection of it weighs me down, and makes me for the moment wretched. Reading and writing on my knee in our little cabin, I really dreaded the coming of the hour that summoned us to table, and was as glad to escape from it again as if it had been a penance or a punishment. Healthy cheerfulness and good spirits forming a part of the banquet, I could soak my crusts in the fountain with Le Sage's strolling player, and revel in their glad enjoyment. But sitting down with so many fellow animals to ward off thirst and hunger as a business, to empty each creature his Yahoo's trough as quickly as he can, and then slink sullenly away, to have these social sacraments stripped of everything but the mere greedy satisfaction of the natural cravings, goes so against the grain with me, that I seriously believe that the recollection of these funeral feasts will be a waking nightmare to me all my life. There was some relief in this boat too, which there had not been in the other, for the captain, a blunt, good-natured fellow, had his handsome wife with him, who was disposed to be lively and agreeable, as were a few other lady passengers who had their seats about us at the same end of the table. But nothing could have made head against the depressing influence of the general body. There was a magnetism of dullness in them which would have beaten down the most facetious companion that the earth ever knew. A jest would have been a crime, and a smile would have faded into grinning horror. Such deadly, leaden people, such systematic plodding, weary, insupportable heaviness, such a mass of animated indigestion in respect of all that was genial, jovial, frank, social, or hearty, never, sure, was brought together elsewhere since the world began. Nor was the scenery, as we approached the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, at all inspiring in its influence. The trees were stunted in their growth, the banks were low and flat, the settlements and log cabins fewer in number, their inhabitants more wan and wretched than any we had encountered yet. No songs of birds were in the air, no pleasant scents, no moving lights and shadows from swift passing clouds. Hour after hour the changeless glare of the hot, unwinking sky shone upon the same monotonous objects. Hour after hour the river rolled along, as wearily and slowly as time itself. At length, upon the morning of the third day, we arrived at a spot so much more desolate than any we had yet beheld, that the forlornest places we had passed were, in comparison with it, full of interest. At the junction of the two rivers, on ground so flat and low and marshy, that at certain seasons of the year it is inundated to the housetops, lies a breeding place of fever, ague, and death, vaunted in England as a mine of golden hope, and speculated in on the faith of monstrous representations to many people's ruin. A dismal swamp, on which the half-built houses rot away, cleared here and there for the space of a few yards, and teeming then with rank unwholesome vegetation, in whose baleful shade the wretched wanderers who are tempted hither droop and die, and lay their bones. The hateful Mississippi circling and eddying before it, and turning off upon its southern course a slimy monster hideous to behold. A hotbed of disease, an ugly sepulchre, a grave uncheered by any gleam of promise, a place without one single quality in earth or air or water to commend it. Such is this dismal Cairo. But what words shall describe the Mississippi, great father of rivers, who, praise be to Heaven, has no young children like him? An enormous ditch, sometimes 2 or 3 miles wide, running liquid mud 6 miles an hour, its strong and frothy current choked and obstructed everywhere by huge logs and whole forest trees, now twining themselves together in great rafts from the interstices of such a sledgy, lazy foam works up, to float upon the water's top, now rolling past like monstrous bodies, their tangled roots showing like matted hair, now glancing singly by like giant leeches, and now wreathing round and round in the vortex of some small whirlpool, like wounded snakes. The banks low, the trees dwarfish, the marshes swarming with frogs, the wretched cabins few and far apart, their inmates hollow cheeked and pale, the weather very hot, mosquitoes penetrating into every crack and crevice of the boat, mud and slime on everything, nothing pleasant in its aspect but the harmless lighting which flickers every night upon the dark horizon. For 2 days we toiled up this foul stream, striking constantly against the floating timber, or stopping to avoid those other more dangerous obstacles, the snags, or sawyers, which are the hidden trunks of trees that have their roots below the tide. When the nights are very dark, the lookout stationed in the head of the boat knows by the ripple of the water if any great impediment be near at hand, and rings a bell beside him, which is the signal for the engine to be stopped. But always in the night this bell has work to do, and after every ring there comes a blow which renders it no easy matter to remain in bed. The decline of day here was very gorgeous, tinging the firmament deeply with red and gold, up to the very keystone of the arch above us. As the sun went down behind the bank, the slightest blades of grass upon it seemed to become as distinctly visible as the arteries in the skeleton of a leaf; and when, as it slowly sank, the red and golden bars upon the water grew dimmer, and dimmer yet, as if they were sinking too, and all the glowing colours of departed day paled, inch by inch, before the sombre night, the scene became 1,000 times more lonesome and more dreary than before, and all its influences darkened with the sky. We drank the muddy water of this river while we were upon it. It is considered wholesome by the natives, and is something more opaque than gruel. I have seen water like it at the filter shops, but nowhere else. On the 4th night after leaving Louisville, we reached St. Louis, and here I witnessed the conclusion of an incident, trifling though in itself, but very pleasant to see, which had interested me during the whole journey. There was a little woman on board, with a little baby, and both little woman and little child were cheerful, good looking, bright eyed, and fair to see. The little woman had been passing a long time with her sick mother in New York, and had left her home in St. Louis, in that condition which ladies who truly love their lords desire to be. The baby was born in her mother's house, and she had not seen her husband, to whom she was now returning, for 12 months, having left him a month or 2 after their marriage. Well, to be sure, there never was a little woman so full of hope and tenderness and love and anxiety as this little woman was, and all day long she wondered whether he would be at the wharf, and whether he had got her letter, and whether, if she sent the baby ashore by somebody else, he would know it, meeting it in the street, which, seeing that he had never set eyes upon it in his life, was not very likely in the abstract, but was probable enough to the young mother. She was such an artless little creature, and was in such a sunny, beaming, hopeful state, and let all of this matter cling close about her heart so freely, that all the other lady passengers entered into the spirit of it as much as she; and the captain, who heard about it from his wife, was wondrously sly, I promise you, inquiring every time we met at table, as in forgetfulness, whether she expected anybody to meet her at St. Louis, and whether she would want to go ashore the night we reached it, but he supposed she wouldn't; and cutting many other dry jokes of that nature. There was one little weazen, dried apple faced old woman, who took occasion to doubt the constancy of husbands in such circumstances of bereavement; and there was another lady with a lap dog, old enough to moralize on the lightness of human affections, and yet not so old that she could help nursing the baby now and then, or laughing with the rest, when the little woman called it by its father's name, and asked it all manner of fantastic questions concerning him in the joy of her heart. It was something of a blow to the little woman that when we were within 20 miles of our destination, it became clearly necessary to put this baby to bed; but she got over it with the same good humour, tied a handkerchief around her head, and came out into the little gallery with the rest. Then such an oracle as she became in reference to the localities, and such facetiousness as was displayed by the married ladies, and such sympathy as was shown by the single ones, and such peals of laughter as the little woman herself, who would just as soon have cried, greeted every jest with. At last there were lights of the St. Louis, and here was the wharf, and those were the steps; and the little woman, covering her face with her hands, and laughing, or seeming to laugh, more than ever, ran into her own cabin and shut herself up. I have no doubt, in the charming inconsistency of such excitement, she stopped her ears, lest she should hear him asking for her, but I did not see her do it. Then a great crowd of people rushed on board, though the boat was not yet made fast, but was wandering about among the other boats, to find a landing place; and everybody looked for the husband, and nobody saw him, when in the midst of us all, heaven knows how she ever got there, there was the little woman clinging with both arms tight around the neck of a fine, good looking, sturdy young fellow; and in a moment afterwards there she was again, actually clapping her little hands for joy, as she dragged him through the small door of her small cabin to look at the baby as he lay asleep. We went to a large hotel called the Planter's House, built like an English hospital, with long passages and bare walls, and skylights above the room doors for the free circulation of air. There were a great many boarders in it, and as many lights sparkled and glistened from the windows down into the street below when we drove up, as if it had been illuminated on some occasion of rejoicing. It is an excellent house, and the proprietors have most bountiful notions of providing the creature comforts. Dining alone with my wife in our own room one day, I counted 14 dishes on the table at once. In the old French portion of the town, the thoroughfares are narrow and crooked, and some of the houses are very quaint and picturesque, being built of wood, with tumble-down galleries before the windows, approachable by stairs, or rather ladders, from the street. There are queer little barber shops and drinking houses too in this quarter, and abundance of crazy old tenements with blinking casements, such as may be seen in Flanders. Some of these ancient habitations, with high garret gable windows perking into the roofs, have a kind of French shrug about them, and being lopsided with age, appear to hold their heads askew, besides, as if they were grimacing in astonishment at the American improvements. It is hardly necessary to say that these consist of wharfs and warehouses, and new buildings in all directions, and of a great many vast plans which are still progressing. Already, however, some very good houses, broad streets, and marble-fronted shops, have gone so far ahead as to be in a state of completion, and the town bids fair in a few years to improve considerably, though it is not likely ever to vie, in point of excellence or beauty, with Cincinnati. The Roman Catholic religion, introduced here by the early French settlers, prevails extensively. Among the public institutions are a Jesuit college, a convent for the Ladies of the Sacred Heart, and a large chapel attached to the college, which was in course of erection at the time of my visit, and was intended to be consecrated on the 2nd of December in the next year. The architect of this building is one of the reverend fathers of the school, and the works proceeded under his sole direction. The organ will be sent from Belgium. In addition to these establishments, there is a Roman Catholic cathedral, dedicated to the Saint Francis Xavier, and a hospital founded by the munificence of a deceased resident, who was a member of that church. It also sends missionaries from thence among the Indian tribes. The Unitarian Church is represented in this remote place, as in most other parts of America, by a gentleman of great worth and excellence. The poor have good reason to remember and bless it, for it befriends them, and aids the cause of rational education without any sectarian or selfish views. It is liberal in all its actions, of kind construction, and of wide benevolence. There are 3 free schools already erected and in full operation in this city. A 4th is building, and will soon be opened. No man ever admits the unhealthiness of the place he dwells in, unless he is going away from it; and I shall therefore, I have no doubt, be at issue with the inhabitants of St. Louis, in questioning the perfect salubrity of its climate, and in hinting that I think it must rather dispose to fever in the summer and autumnal seasons; just adding that it is very hot, lies among great rivers, and has vast tracts of undrained swampy land around it. I leave the reader to form his own opinion. As I had a great desire to see a prairie before turning back from the furthest point of my wanderings, and as some gentlemen of the town had, in their hospitable consideration, an equal desire to gratify me, a day was fixed before my departure for an expedition to the Looking Glass Prairie, which is within 30 miles of the town. Deeming it possible that my readers may not object to know what kind of a thing such a gipsy party may be at that distance from home, and among what sort of objects it moves, I will describe the jaunt in another chapter. End of chapter 12. Recording by Rick Cornwall. Section 15 of American Notes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rick Cornwall. American Notes by Charles Dickens. Chapter 13. A Jaunt to the Looking Glass Prairie and Back. I may premise that the word prairie is variously pronounced parairer, parairer, parorer. The latter mode of pronunciation is perhaps the most in favor. We were 14 in all, and all young men. Indeed, it is a singular though very natural feature in the society of these distant settlements, that it is mainly composed of adventurous persons in the prime of life, and has very few grey heads among it. There were no ladies, the trip being a fatiguing one, and we were to start at 5 o'clock in the morning, punctually. I was called at 4, that I might be certain of keeping nobody waiting, and having got some bread and milk for breakfast, threw up the window and looked down into the street, expecting to see the whole party buzzily astir, and great preparations going on below. But as everything was very quiet, and the street presented that hopeless aspect with which 5 o'clock in the morning is familiar elsewhere, I deemed it as well to go to bed again, and went accordingly. I woke again at 7 o'clock, and by that time the party had assembled, and were gathered around one light carriage with a very stout axle-tree, one something on wheels like an amateur carrier's cart, one double phaeton of great antiquity and unearthly construction, one gig with a great hole in its back and a broken head, and one rider on horseback who was to go on before. I got into the first coach with 3 companions. The rest bestowed themselves in the other vehicles. 2 large baskets were made fast to the lightest. 2 large stone jars in wicker cases, technically known as demijohns, were consigned to the least rowdy of the party for safe keeping, and the procession moved off to the ferry boat, in which it was to cross the river bodily, men, horses, carriages, and all, as the manner in these parts is. We got over the river in due course, and mustered again before a little wooden box on wheels, hove down all aslant in a morass, with "Merchant Taylor" painted in very large letters over the door. Having settled the order of proceeding, and the road to be taken, we started off once more, and began to make our way through an ill-favoured black hollow, called less expressively the American Bottom. The previous day had been, not to say hot, for the term is weak and lukewarm in its power of conveying an idea of the temperature. The town had been on fire, in a blaze, but at night it had come on to rain in torrents, and all night long it had rained without cessation. We had a pair of very strong horses, but travelled at the rate of little more than a couple of miles an hour, through one unbroken slough of black mud and water. It had no variety but in depth. Now it was only a half over the wheels, now it hid the axle-tree, and now the coach sank down in it almost to the windows. The air resounded in all directions with the loud chirping of the frogs, who with the pigs, a coarse, ugly breed, and unwholesome looking as though they were the spontaneous growth of the country, had the whole scene to themselves. Here and there we passed a log hut, but the wretched cabins were wide apart and thinly scattered, for though the soil is very rich in this place, few people can exist in such a deadly atmosphere. On either side of the track, if it deserved the name, was the thick bush, and everywhere was stagnant, slimy, rotten, filthy water. As it is the custom in those parts to give a horse a gallon or so of cold water whenever he is in foam with heat, we halted for that purpose, at a log inn in the wood, far removed from any other residence. It consisted of one room, bare roofed and bare walled of course, with a loft above. The ministering priest was a swarthy young savage, in a shirt of cotton print like bed furniture, and a pair of ragged trousers. There were a couple of young boys too, nearly naked, lying idly by the well, and they, and he, and the traveller at the inn, turned out to look at us. The traveller was an old man with grey grizzly beard 2 inches long, a shaggy moustache of the same hue, and enormous eyebrows, which almost obscured his lazy, semi-drunken glance as he stood regarding us with folded arms, poising himself alternately upon his toes and heels. On being addressed by one of the party, he drew nearer, and said, rubbing his cheek, which scraped under his horny hand like fresh gravel beneath a nailed shoe, that he was from Delaware, and had lately bought a farm down there, pointing into one of the marshes where the stunted trees were thickest. He was going, he added, to St. Louis to fetch his family, whom he had left behind, but he seemed in no great hurry to bring on those encumbrances, for when we moved away, he loitered back into the cabin, and was plainly bent on stopping there as long as his money lasted. He was a great politician, of course, and explained his opinions at some length to one of our company, but I only remember that he concluded with 2 sentiments, one of which was somebody for ever, and the other, blast everybody else, which is by no means a bad abstract of the general creed in these matters. When the horses were swollen out to about twice their natural dimensions, there seems to be an idea here that this kind of inflation improves their going. We bent forward again, through mud and mire, and damp, and festering heat, and brake and bush, attended always by the music of the frogs and pigs, until nearly noon, when we halted at a place called Veldhuis. Veldhuis was a small collection of wooden houses, huddled together in the very heart of the bush and swamp. Many of them had singularly bright doors of red and yellow, for the place had been lately visited by a travelling painter, who got along, as I was told, by eating his way. The criminal court was sitting, and was at that moment trying some criminals for horse stealing, with whom it would most likely go hard, for livestock of all kinds, being necessarily very much exposed in the woods, is held by the community in rather higher value than human life, and for this reason juries generally make a point of finding all men indicted for cattle stealing guilty, whether or no. The horses belonging to the bar, the judge, and the witnesses were tied to temporary racks set up roughly in the road, by which is to be understood a forest path nearly knee-deep in mud and slime. There was an hotel in this place, which, like all hotels in America, had its large dining room for the public table. It was an odd, shambling, low-roofed outhouse, half cowshed and half kitchen, with a coarse brown canvas tablecloth, and tin sconces stuck against the wall to hold candles at supper time. The horsemen had gone forward to have coffee and some edibles prepared, and they were by this time nearly ready. He had ordered wheat bread and chicken fixings in preference to corn bread and common doings. The latter kind of rejection includes only pork and bacon. The former comprehends broiled ham, sausages, veal cutlets, steaks, and such other viands of that nature as may be supposed, by a tolerably wide poetical construction, to fix a chicken comfortably in the digestive organs of any lady or man. On one of the doorposts at this inn was a tin plate, whereupon was inscribed in characters of gold, "Dr. Crocus," and on a sheet of paper, pasted up by the side of this plate, was a written announcement that Dr. Crocus would that evening deliver a lecture on phrenology for the benefit of the Belleville public, at a charge for admission of so much a head. Straying upstairs during the preparation of the chicken fixings, I happened to pass the doctor's chamber, and as the door stood wide open and the room was empty, I made bold to peep in. It was a bare, unfurnished, comfortless room, with an unframed portrait hanging up at the head of the bed, a likeness, I take it, of the doctor, for the forehead was fully displayed, and great stress was laid by the artist upon its phrenological developments. The bed itself was covered with an old patchwork counterpane. The room was destitute of carpet or of curtain. There was a damp fireplace without any stove, full of wood ashes, a chair, and a very small table; and on the last named piece of furniture was displayed in grand array the doctor's library, consisting of some half dozen greasy old books. Now it certainly looked about the last apartment on the whole earth out of which any man would be likely to get anything to do him any good. But the door, as I have said, stood coaxingly open, and plainly said, in conjunction with the chair, the portrait, the table, and the books, "Walk in, gentlemen, walk in. Don't be ill, gentlemen, when you may be well in no time. Dr. Crocus is here, gentlemen, the celebrated Dr. Crocus. Dr. Crocus has come all this way to cure you, gentlemen. If you haven't heard of Dr. Crocus, it's your fault, gentlemen, who live a little way out of the world here, not Dr. Crocus's. Walk in, gentlemen, walk in." In the passage below, when I went downstairs again, was Dr. Crocus himself. A crowd had flocked in from the courthouse, and a voice from among them called out to the landlord, "Colonel, introduce Dr. Crocus." "Mr. Dickens," says the colonel, "Dr. Crocus." Upon which Dr. Crocus, who is a tall, fine-looking Scotchman, but rather fierce and warlike in appearance for a professor of the peaceful art of healing, burst out of the concourse with his right arm extended, and his chest thrown out as far as it will possibly come, and says, "Your countryman, sir." Whereupon Dr. Crocus and I shake hands, and Dr. Crocus looks as if I didn't by any means realize his expectations, which, in a linen blouse, and a great straw hat with a green ribbon, and no gloves, and my face and nose profusely ornamented with stings of mosquitoes and the bites of bugs, it is very likely I did not. "Long in these parts, sir?" says I. "3 or 4 months, sir," says the doctor. "Do you think of soon returning to the old country?" says I. Dr. Crocus made no verbal answer, but gives me an imploring look, which says so plainly, "Will you ask me that again a little louder, if you please?" that I repeat the question. "Think of soon returning to the old country, sir?" repeats the doctor. "To the old country, sir," I rejoin. Dr. Crocus looks around upon the crowd to observe the effect he produces, rubs his hands, and says in a very loud voice, "Not yet awhile, sir, not yet. You won't catch me at that just yet, sir. I'm a little too fond of freedom for that, sir. Ha, ha! It's not so easy for a man to tear himself from a free country such as this is, sir. Ha, ha! No, no! Ha, ha! None of that till one's obliged to do it, sir. No, no!" As Dr. Crocus says these latter words, he shakes his head, knowingly, and laughs again. Many of the bystanders shake their heads in concert with the doctor, and laugh too, and look at each other as much as to say, "A pretty bright and first-rate sort of chap is Crocus." And unless I'm very much mistaken, a good many people went to the lecture that night, who never thought about phrenology, or about Dr. Crocus either, in all their lives before. From Belleville we went on, through the same desolate kind of waste, and constantly attended, without the interval of a moment, by the same music, until at 3 o'clock in the morning we halted once more at a village called Lebanon, to inflate the horses again, and give them some corn besides, of which they stood much in need. Pending this ceremony, I walked into the village, where I met a full-sized dwelling house coming downhill at a round trot, drawn by a score or more of oxen. The public house was so very clean and good a one, that the managers of the Jaunt resolved to return to it and put up there for the night if possible. This course decided on, and the horses being well refreshed, we again pushed forward, and came upon the prairie at sunset. It would be difficult to say why or how, though it was possibly from having heard and read so much about it, but the effect on me was disappointment. Looking towards the setting sun, there lay, stretched out before my view, a vast expanse of level ground, unbroken save by one thin line of trees, which scarcely amounted to a scratch upon the great blank, until it met the glowing sky, wherein it seemed to dip, mingling with its rich colours and mellowing in its distant blue. There it lay, a tranquil sea or lake without water, if such a simile be admissible, with the day going down upon it, a few birds wheeling here and there, and solitude and silence reigning paramount around. But the grass was not yet high, there were bare black patches on the ground, and the few wild flowers that the eye could see were poor and scanty. Great as the picture was, its very flatness and extent, which left nothing to the imagination, tamed it down and cramped its interests. I felt little of that sense of freedom and exhilaration which a Scottish heath inspires, or even our English downs awakens. It was lonely and wild, but oppressive in its barren monotony. I felt that in traversing the prairies, I could never abandon myself to the scene, forgetful of all else, as I should do so instinctively, were the heather underneath my feet, or an iron-bound coast beyond, but should often glance toward the distant and frequently receding line of the horizon, and wish it gained and passed. It is not a scene to be forgotten, but is scarcely one, I think, at all events as I saw it, to remember with much pleasure, or to covet the looking on again in after life. We encamped near a solitary log house for the sake of its water, and dined upon the plain. The baskets contained roast fowls, buffalo's tongue, an exquisite dainty by the way, ham, bread, cheese, and butter, biscuits, champagne, sherry, lemons, and sugar for punch, and abundance of rough ice. The meal was delicious, and the entertainers were the soul of kindness and good humour. I have often recalled that cheerful party to my pleasant recollections since, and shall not easily forget, in junketings nearer home with friends of older date, my boon companions on the prairie. Returning to Lebanon that night, we lay at the little inn at which we had halted in the afternoon. In point of cleanliness and comfort, it would have suffered by no comparison with any English alehouse of a homely kind in England. Rising at 5 o'clock next morning, I took a walk about the village. None of the houses were strolling about today, but it was early for them yet, perhaps, and then amused myself by lounging in a kind of farmyard behind the tavern, of which the leading features were a strange jumble of rough sheds for stables, a rude colonnade built as a cool place of summer resort, a deep well, a great earthen mound for keeping vegetables in winter time, and a pigeon house, whose little apertures looked, as they did in all pigeon houses, very much too small for the admission of the plump and swelling breasted birds who were strutting about it, though they tried to get in never so hard. That interest exhausted, I took a survey of the inn's 2 parlours, which were decorated with coloured prints of Washington and President Madison, and of a white-faced young lady, much speckled by the flies, who held up her gold-necked chain for the admiration of the spectator, and informed all admiring comers that she was just 17, although I should have thought her older. In the best room were 2 oil portraits of the Kit Kat size, representing the landlord and his infant son, both looking as bold as lions, and staring out of the canvas with an intensity that would have been cheap at any price. They were painted, I think, by the artist who had touched up the Belleville doors with red and gold, for I seemed to recognize his style immediately. After breakfast, we started to return by a different way from that which we had taken yesterday, and coming up at 10 o'clock with an encampment of German immigrants carrying their goods in carts, who had made a rousing fire which they were just quitting, stopped there to refresh. And very pleasant the fire was, for hot though it had been yesterday, it was quite cold today, and the wind blew keenly. Looming in the distance as we rode along was another of the ancient Indian burial places, called the Monk's Mound, in memory of a body of fanatics of the order of La Trappe, who founded a desolate convent there many years ago, when there were no settlers within 1,000 miles, and were all swept off by a pernicious climate. in which lamentable fatality few rational people would suppose, perhaps, that society experienced any very severe deprivation. The track of today had the same features as the track of yesterday. There was the swamp, the bush, and the perpetual chorus of frogs, the rank unseemly growth, the unwholesome steaming earth. Here and there, and frequently too, we encountered a solitary broken down wagon, full of some new settler's goods. It was a pitiful sight to see one of these vehicles deep in the mire, the axle tree broken, the wheel lying idly by its side, the man going miles away to look for assistance, the woman seated among their wandering household gods with a baby at her breast, a picture of forlorn, dejected patience, the team of oxen crouching down mournfully in the mud, and breathing forth such clouds of vapour from their mouth and nostrils, that all the damp mist and fog around seemed to have come direct from them. In due time we mustered once again before the merchants' tailors, and having done so, crossed over to the city in the ferry boat, passing on the way a spot called Bloody Island, the duelling ground of St. Louis, and so designated in honour of the last fatal combat fought there, which was with pistols breast to breast. Both combatants fell dead upon the ground, and possibly some rational people may think of them as of the gloomy madmen on the Monk's Mound, that they were no great loss to the community. End of chapter 13. Recording by Rick Cornwall.
Chapter 14 of American Notes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Alisson Veldhuis. Chapter 14. Return to Cincinnati, a stagecoach ride from that city to Columbus, and thence to Sandusky, so by Lake Erie to the Falls of Niagara. As I had a desire to travel through the interior of the state of Ohio, and to strike the lakes, as the phrase is, at a small town called Sandusky, to which that route would conduct us on our way to Niagara, we had to return from St. Louis by the way we had come, and to retrace our former track as far as Cincinnati. The day on which we were to take leave of St. Louis being very fine, and the steamboat, which was to have started I don't know how early in the morning, postponing, for the third or fourth time, her departure until the afternoon, we rowed forward to an old French village on the river, called properly Carondelet, and nicknamed Vide Poche, and arranged that the packet should call for us there. The place consisted of a few poor cottages, and 2 or 3 public houses, the state of whose larders certainly seemed to justify the second designation of the village, for there was nothing to eat in any of them. At length, however, by going back some half a mile or so, we found a solitary house where ham and coffee were procurable, and there we tarried to await the advent of the boat, which would come in sight from the green before the door, a long way off. It was a neat, unpretending village tavern, and we took our repast in a quaint little room with a bed in it, decorated with some old oil paintings, which in their time had probably done duty in a Catholic chapel or monastery. The fare was very good, and served with great cleanliness. The house was kept by a characteristic old couple, with whom we had a long talk, and who were perhaps a very good sample of that kind of people in the West. The landlord was a dry, tough, hard-faced old fellow, not so very old either, for he was but just turned 60, I should think, who had been out with the militia in the last war with England, and had seen all kinds of service except a battle. He had been very near seeing that, he added, very near. He had all his life been restless and locomotive, with an irresistible desire for change, and was still the son of his old self. For if he had nothing to keep him at home, he said, slightly jerking his hat and his thumb towards the window of the room in which the old lady sat, as we stood talking in front of the house, he would clean up his musket and be off to Texas to-morrow morning. He was one of the very many descendants of Cain proper to this continent, who seemed destined from their birth to serve as pioneers in the great human army, who gladly go on from year to year, extending its outposts, and leaving home after home behind them, and die at last, utterly regardless of their graves being left thousands of miles behind by the wandering generations who succeed. His wife was a domesticated, kind-hearted old soul, who had come with him from the queen city of the world, which, it seemed, was Philadelphia, but had no love for this western country, and indeed had little reason to bear at any, having seen her children one by one die here of fever in the full prime and beauty of their youth. Her heart was sore, she said, to think of them, and to talk on this theme even to strangers in that blighted place so far from her old home eased it somewhat, and became a melancholy pleasure. The boat appearing towards evening, we bade adieu to the poor old lady and her vagrant spouse, and making for the nearest landing place, was soon on board the Messenger again in our old cabin, and steaming down the Mississippi. If the coming up this river, slowly making head against the stream, be an irksome journey, the shooting down it with the turbid current is almost worse. For then the boat, proceeding at the rate of 12 or 15 miles an hour, has to force its passage through a labyrinth of floating logs, which, in the dark, it is often impossible to see beforehand or avoid. All that night the bell was never silent, for 5 minutes at a time, and after every ring the vessel reeled again, sometimes beneath a single blow, sometimes beneath a dozen dealt in quick succession, the lightest of which seemed more than enough to beat in her frail keel, as though it had been pie crust. Looking down upon the filthy river after dark, it seemed to be alive with monsters as these black masses rolled upon the surface, or came starting up again head first, when the boat, in ploughing her way among a shoal of such obstructions, drove a few among them, for a moment, under water. Sometimes the engine stopped during a long interval, and then before her and behind, and gathering close about her on all sides, were so many of these ill-favoured obstacles that she was fairly hemmed in, the centre of a floating island, and was constrained to pause until they parted somewhere, as dark clouds will do before the wind, and opened by degrees a channel out. In good time next morning, however, we came again in sight of the detestable morass called Cairo, and stopping there to take in wood, lay alongside a barge, whose starting timbers scarcely held together. It was moored to the bank, and on its side was painted "Coffee House," that being, I suppose, the floating paradise to which the people fly for shelter when they lose their houses for a month or two beneath the hideous waters of the Mississippi. But looking southward from this point, we had the satisfaction of seeing that intolerable river dragging its slimy length and ugly freight abruptly off towards New Orleans, and passing a yellow line which stretched across the current, were again upon the clear Ohio, never, I trust, to see the Mississippi more, saving in troubled dreams and nightmares. Leaving it for the company of its sparkling neighbour was like the transition from pain to ease, or the awakening from a horrible vision to cheerful realities. We arrived at Louisville on the 4th night, and gladly availed ourselves of its excellent hotel. Next day we went on in the Ben Franklin, a beautiful mail steamboat, and reached Cincinnati shortly after midnight. Being by this time nearly tired of sleeping upon shelves, we had remained awake to go ashore straightway, and groping a passage across the dark decks of other boats, and among labyrinths of engine machinery and leaking casks of molasses, we reached the streets, knocked up the porter at the hotel where we had stayed before, and were, to our great joy, safely housed soon afterwards. We rested but one day at Cincinnati, and then resumed our journey to Sandusky. As it comprised two varieties of stage-coach travelling, which, with those I have already glanced at, comprehend the main characteristics of this mode of transit in America, I will take the reader as our fellow passenger, and pledge myself to perform the distance with all possible dispatch. Our place of destination, in the first instance, is Columbus. It is distant about 120 miles from Cincinnati, but there is a macadamized road, rare blessing, the whole way, and the rate of travelling upon it is 6 miles an hour. We start at 8 o'clock in the morning in a great mail coach, whose huge cheeks are so very ruddy and plethoric that it appears to be troubled with a tendency of blood to the head. Dropsical it certainly is, for it will hold a dozen passengers inside. But wonderful to add, it is very clean and bright, being nearly new, and rattles through the streets of Cincinnati gaily. Our way lies through a beautiful country richly cultivated and luxuriant in its promise of an abundant harvest. Sometimes we pass a field where the strong bristling stalks of Indian corn look like a crop of walking sticks, and sometimes an enclosure where the green wheat is springing up among a labyrinth of stumps. The primitive worm fence is universal, and an ugly thing it is, but the farms are neatly kept, and save for these differences one might be travelling just now in Kent. We often stop to water at a roadside inn, which is always dull and silent. The coachman dismounts and fills his bucket, and holds it to the horses' heads. There is scarcely ever any one to help him. There are seldom any loungers standing round, and never any stable company with jokes to crack. Sometimes, when we have changed our team, there is a difficulty in starting again, arising out of the prevalent mode of breaking a young horse, which is to catch him, harness him against his will, and put him in a stage-coach without further notice. But we get on somehow or other, after a great many kicks and a violent struggle, and jog on as before again. Occasionally, when we stop to change, some 2 or 3 half-drunken loafers will come loitering out with their hands in their pockets, or will be seen kicking their heels in rocking-chairs, or lounging on the window-sill, or sitting on a rail within the colonnade. They have not often anything to say, though, either to us or to each other, but sit there idly staring at the coaches and horses. The landlord of the inn is usually among them, and seems, of all the party, to be the least connected with the business of the house. Indeed, he is, with reference to the tavern, what the driver is in relation to the coach and passengers. Whatever happens in his sphere of action, he is quite indifferent, and perfectly easy in his mind. The frequent change of coachman works no change or variety in the coachman's character. He is always dirty, sullen, and taciturn. If he be capable of smartness of any kind, moral or physical, he has a faculty of concealing it, which is truly marvellous. He never speaks to you as you sit beside him on the box, and if you speak to him, he answers, if at all, in monosyllables. He points out nothing on the road, and seldom looks at anything, being to all appearance thoroughly weary of it and of existence generally. As to doing the honours of his coach, his business, as I have said, is with the horses. The coach follows because it is attached to them and goes on wheels, not because you are in it. Sometimes, towards the end of a long stage, he suddenly breaks out into a discordant fragment of an election song, but his face never sings along with him. It is only his voice, and not often that. He always chews, and always spits, and never encumbers himself with a pocket-handkerchief. The consequences to the box passenger, especially when the wind blows towards him, are not agreeable. Whenever the coach stops, and you can hear the voices of the inside passengers, or whenever any bystander addresses them, or any one among them, or they address each other, you will hear one phrase repeated over and over and over again, to the most extraordinary extent. It is an ordinary and unpromising phrase enough, being neither more nor less than "Yes, sir," but it is adapted to every variety of circumstance, and fills up every pause in the conversation. Thus: the time is 1 o'clock at noon. The scene, a place where we are to stay and dine on this journey. The coach drives up to the door of an inn. The day is warm, and there are several idlers lingering about the tavern and waiting for the public dinner. Among them is a stout gentleman in a brown hat, swinging himself to and fro in a rocking-chair on the pavement. As the coach stops, a gentleman in a straw hat looks out of the window. Straw hat to the stout gentleman in the rocking-chair: "I reckon that's Judge Jefferson, ain't it?" Brown hat, still swinging, speaking very slowly and without any emotion whatever: "Yes, sir." Straw hat: "Warm weather, Judge." Brown hat: "Yes, sir." Straw hat: "There was a snap of cold last week." Brown hat: "Yes, sir." Straw hat: "Yes, sir." A pause. They look at each other very seriously. Straw hat: "I calculate you'll have got through that case of the corporation, Judge, by this time now." Brown hat: "Yes, sir." Straw hat: "How did the verdict go, sir?" Brown Hat. For the defendant, sir. Straw Hat, interrogatively. Yes, sir? Brown Hat, affirmatively. Yes, sir. Both, musingly, as each gazes down the street. Yes, sir. Another pause. They look at each other again, still more seriously than before. Brown Hat. This coach is rather behind its time to-day, I guess. Straw Hat, doubtingly. Yes, sir. Brown Hat, looking at his watch. Yes, sir, nigh upon 2 hours. Straw Hat, raising his eyebrows in very great surprise. Yes, sir. Brown Hat, decisively, as he puts up his watch. Yes, sir. All the other inside passengers among themselves. Yes, sir. Coachman, in a very surly tone. No, it ain't. Straw Hat, to the coachman. Well, I don't know, sir. We were a pretty tall time coming that last 15 mile, that's a fact. The coachman, making no reply, and plainly declining to enter into any controversy on a subject so far removed from his sympathies and feelings, another passenger says, Yes, sir. And the gentleman in the straw hat, in acknowledgment of his courtesy, says, Yes, sir, to him in return. The straw hat then inquires of the brown hat whether that coach in which he, the straw hat, then sits, is not a new one. To which the brown hat again makes answer, Yes, sir. Straw Hat. I thought so. Pretty loud smell of varnish, sir. Brown Hat. Yes, sir. All the other inside passengers. Yes, sir. Brown Hat, to the company in general. Yes, sir. The conversational powers of the company having been by this time pretty heavily taxed, the straw hat opens the door and gets out, and all the rest alight also. We dine soon afterwards with the boarders in the house, and have nothing to drink, tea and coffee. And they are both very bad, and the water is worse. I ask for brandy. But it is a temperance hotel, and spirits are not to be had for love or money. This preposterous forcing of unpleasant drinks down the reluctant throats of travellers is not at all uncommon in America, but I never discovered that the scruples of such wincing landlords induce them to preserve any unusually nice balance between the quality of their fare and the scale of charges. On the contrary, I rather suspected them of diminishing the one and exalting the other by way of recompense for the loss of their profit on the sale of spirituous liquors. After all, perhaps, the plainest course for persons of such tender consciences would be a total abstinence from tavern-keeping. Dinner over, we get into another vehicle, which is ready at the door, for the coachman has been changed in the interval, and resume our journey, which continues through the same kind of country until evening, when we come to the town where we are to stop for tea and supper, and having delivered the mail-bags at the post-office, ride through the usual wide street, lined with the usual stores and houses, the drapers always having hung up at their door, by way of sign, a piece of bright red cloth, to the hotel where this meal is prepared. There being many boarders here, we sit down, a large party, and a very melancholy one as usual. But there is a buxom hostess at the head of the table, and opposite, a simple Welsh schoolmaster with his wife and child, who came here on a speculation of greater promise than performance to teach the classics, and they are sufficient subjects of interest until the meal is over and another coach is ready. In it we go on once more, lighted by a bright moon, until midnight, when we stop to change the coach again, and remain for half an hour or so in a miserable room, with the blurred lithograph of Washington over the smoky fireplace, and a mighty jug of cold water on the table, to which refreshment the moody passengers do so apply themselves that they would seem to be, one and all, keen patients of Dr. Sangrado. Among them is a very little boy who chews tobacco like a very big one, and a droning gentleman who talks arithmetically and statistically on all subjects from poetry downwards, and who always speaks in the same key, with exactly the same emphasis, and with very grave deliberation. He came outside just now and told me how that the uncle of a certain young lady who had been spirited away and married by a certain captain lived in these parts, and how this uncle was so valiant and ferocious that he shouldn't wonder if he were to follow the said captain to England, and shoot him down in the street wherever he found him. in the feasibility of which strong measure I, being for the moment rather prone to contradiction, from feeling half asleep and very tired, declined to acquiesce, assuring him that if uncle did resort to it, or gratified any other little whim of the like nature, he would find himself one morning prematurely throttled at the Old Bailey, and that he would do well to make his will before he went, as he would certainly want it before he had been in Britain very long. On we go, all night, and by the day begins to break, and presently the first cheerful rays of the warm sun come slanting on us brightly. It sheds its light upon a miserable waste of sodden grass, and dull trees, and squalid huts, whose aspect is forlorn and grievous in the last degree. A very desert in the wood, whose growth of green is dank and noxious, like that upon the top of standing water, where poisonous fungus grows in the rare footprint on the oozy ground, and sprouts like witches' coral from the crevices in the cabin wall and floor. It is a hideous thing to lie upon the very threshold of a city, but it was purchased years ago, and as the owner cannot be discovered, the state has been unable to reclaim it. So there it remains in the midst of cultivation and improvement, like ground accursed, and made obscene and rank by some great crime. We reached Columbus shortly before 7 o'clock, and stayed there to refresh that day and night, having excellent apartments in a very large unfinished hotel called the Neal House, which were richly fitted with the polished wood of the black walnut, and open on a handsome portico and stone veranda, like rooms in some Italian mansion. The town is clean and pretty, and of course is going to be much larger. It is the seat of the state legislature of Ohio, and lays claim in consequence to some consideration and importance. There being no stage-coach next day, upon the road we wished to take, I hired an extra at a reasonable charge to carry us to Tiffin, a small town from whence there is a railroad to Sandusky. This extra was an ordinary 4-horse stage-coach, such as I have described, changing horses and drivers as the stage-coach would, but was exclusively our own for the journey. To ensure our having horses at the proper stations, and being incommoded by no strangers, the proprietor sent an agent on the box, who was to accompany us the whole way through, and thus attended, and bearing with us besides a hamper full of savoury cold meats, and fruit and wine, we started off again in high spirits at 6:30 o'clock next morning, very much delighted to be by ourselves, and disposed to enjoy even the roughest journey. It was well for us that we were in this humour, for the road we went over that day was certainly enough to have shaken tempers that were not resolutely at set fair down to some inches below stormy. At one time we were all flung together in a heap at the bottom of the coach, and at another we were crushing our heads against the roof. Now one side was down deep in the mire, and we were holding on to the other. Now the coach was lying on the tails of the two wheelers, and now it was rearing up in the air in a frantic state, with all 4 horses standing on the top of an insurmountable eminence, looking coolly back at us, as though they would say, "Unharness us, it can't be done." The drivers on these roads, who certainly get over the ground in a manner which is quite miraculous, so twist and turn the team about in forcing a passage, corkscrew fashion, through the bogs and swamps, that it was quite a common circumstance, on looking out of the window, to see the coachman with the ends of a pair of reins in his hands, apparently driving nothing, or playing at horses, and the leaders staring at one unexpectedly from the back of the coach, as if they had some idea of getting up behind. A great portion of the way was over what is called a corduroy road, which is made by throwing trunks of trees into a marsh, and leaving them to settle there. The very slightest of the jolts with which the ponderous carriage fell from log to log was enough, it seemed, to have dislocated all the bones in the human body. It would be impossible to experience a similar set of sensations in any other circumstances, unless perhaps in attempting to go up to the top of St. Paul's in an omnibus. Never once that day was the coach in any position, attitude, or kind of motion to which we are accustomed in coaches. Never did it make the smallest approach to one's experience of the proceedings of any sort of vehicle that goes on wheels. Still, it was a fine day, and the temperature was delicious, and though we had left summer behind us in the west, and were fast leaving spring, we were moving towards Niagara and home. We alighted in a pleasant wood towards the middle of the day, dined on a fallen tree, and leaving our best fragments with a cottager, and our worst with the pigs, who swarm in this part of the country like grains of sand on the sea-shore, to the great comfort of our commissariat in Canada, we went forward again gaily. As night came on, the track grew narrower and narrower, until at last it so lost itself among the trees that the driver seemed to find his way by instinct. We had the comfort of knowing, at least, that there was no danger in his falling asleep, for every now and then a wheel would strike against an unseen stump with such a jerk that he was fain to hold on pretty tight and pretty quick to keep himself upon the box. Nor was there any reason to dread the least danger from furious driving, inasmuch as over that broken ground the horses had enough to do to walk. As to shying, there was no room for that, and a herd of wild elephants could not have run away in such a wood, with such a coach at their heels. So we stumbled along, quite satisfied. These stumps of trees are a curious feature in American travelling. The varying illusions they present to the unaccustomed eye as it grows dark are quite astonishing in their number and reality. Now there is a Grecian urn erected in the centre of a lonely field; now there is a woman weeping at a tomb; now a very commonplace old gentleman in a white waistcoat, with a thumb thrust into each armhole of his coat; now a student poring on a book; now a crouching negro; now a horse, a dog, a cannon, an armed man, a hunchback throwing off his cloak and stepping forth into the night. They were often as entertaining to me as so many glasses in a magic lantern, and never took their shapes at my bidding, but seemed to force themselves upon me whether I would or no. And strange to say, I sometimes recognised in them counterparts of figures once familiar to me in pictures attached to childish books, forgotten long ago. It soon became too dark, however, even for this amusement, and the trees were so close together that their dry branches rattled against the coach on either side, and obliged us all to keep our heads within. It lightened, too, for 3 whole hours, each flash being very bright, and blue, and long; and as the vivid streaks came darting in among the crowded branches, and the thunder rolled gloomily above the tree-tops, one could scarcely help thinking there were better neighbourhoods at such a time than thick woods afforded. At length, between 10 and 11 o'clock at night, a few feeble lights appeared in the distance, and Upper Sandusky, an Indian village, where we were to stay till morning, lay before us. They were gone to bed at the Log Inn, which was the only house of entertainment in the place, but soon answered to our knocking, and got some tea for us in a sort of kitchen or common room, tapestried with old newspapers pasted against the wall. The bedchamber to which my wife and I were shown was a large, low, ghostly room, with a quantity of withered branches on the hearth, and 2 doors without any fastening, opposite to each other, both opening on the black night and wild country, and so contrived that one of them always blew the other open, a novelty in domestic architecture, which I do not remember to have seen before, and which I was somewhat disconcerted to have forced on my attention after getting into bed, as I have a considerable sum in gold for our travelling expenses in my dressing case. Some of the luggage, however, piled against the panels, soon settled this difficulty, and my sleep would not have been very much affected that night, I believe, though it had failed to do so. My Boston friend climbed up to bed somewhere in the roof, where another guest was already snoring hugely. But being bitten beyond his power of endurance, he turned out again, and fled for shelter to the coach, which was airing itself in front of the house. This was not a very politic step, as it turned out, for the pigs scenting him, and looking upon the coach as a kind of pie with some manner of meat inside, grunted round it so hideously that he was afraid to come out again, and lay there shivering till morning. Nor was it possible to warm him when he did come out by means of a glass of brandy, for in Indian villages the legislature, with a very good and wise intention, forbids the sale of spirits by tavern-keepers. The precaution, however, is quite inefficacious, for the Indians never fail to procure liquor of a worse kind at a dearer price from travelling pedlars. It is a settlement of the Wyandot Indians who inhabit this place. Among the company at breakfast was a mild old gentleman, who had been for many years employed by the United States government in conducting negotiations with the Indians, and who had just concluded a treaty with these people, by which they bound themselves, in consideration of a certain annual sum, to remove next year to some land provided for them west of the Mississippi, and a little way beyond St. Louis. he gave me a moving account of their strong attachment to the familiar scenes of their infancy, and in particular to the burial places of their kindred, and of their great reluctance to leave them. He had witnessed many such removals, and always with pain, though he knew that they departed for their own good. The question whether this tribe should go or stay had been discussed among them a day or two before, in a hut erected for the purpose, the logs of which still lay upon the ground before the inn. When the speaking was done, the ayes and noes were ranged on opposite sides, and every male adult voted in his turn. The moment the result was known, the minority, a large one, cheerfully yielded to the rest, and withdrew all kind of opposition. We met some of these poor Indians afterwards, riding on shaggy ponies. They were so like the meaner sort of gipsies, that if I could have seen any of them in England, I should have concluded as a matter of course they belonged to a wandering and restless people. Leaving this town directly after breakfast, we pushed forward again, over a rather worse road than yesterday, if possible, and arrived about noon at Tiffin, where we parted with the extra. At 2 o'clock we took the railroad, the travelling on which was very slow, its construction being indifferent, and the ground wet and marshy, and arrived at Sandusky in time to dine that evening. We put up at a comfortable little hotel on the brink of Lake Erie, lay there that night, and had no choice but to wait there next day until a steamboat bound for Buffalo appeared. The town, which was sluggish and uninteresting enough, was something like the back of an English watering place out of season. Our host, who was very attentive and anxious to make us comfortable, was a handsome middle-aged man, who had come to this town from New England, in which part of the country he was raised. When I say that he constantly walked in and out of the room with his hat on, and stopped to converse in the same free and easy state, and lay down on our sofa, and pulled his newspaper out of his pocket, and read it at his ease, I merely mention these traits as characteristic of the country, not at all as being matter of complaint, or as having been disagreeable to me. I should undoubtedly be offended by such proceedings at home, because they are not the custom, and where they are not, they would be impertinencies. But in America the only desire of a good-natured fellow of this kind is to treat his guests hospitably and well; and I had no more right, and I can truly say no more disposition, to measure his conduct by our English rule and standard, than I had to quarrel with him for not being of the exact stature which would qualify him for admission into the Queen's Grenadier Guards. As little inclination had I to find fault with a funny old lady who was an upper domestic in this establishment, and who, when she came to wait upon us at any meal, sat herself down comfortably in the most convenient chair, and producing a large pin to pick her teeth with, remained performing that ceremony, and steadfastly regarding us meanwhile with much gravity and composure, now and then pressing us to eat a little more, until it was time to clear away. It was enough for us that whatever we wished done was done with great civility and readiness, and a desire to oblige, not only here but everywhere else, and that all our wants were, in general, zealously anticipated. We were taking an early dinner at this house on the day after our arrival, which was Sunday, when a steamboat came in sight, and presently touched at the wharf. As she proved to be on her way to Buffalo, we hurried on board with all speed, and soon left Sandusky far behind us. She was a large vessel of 500 tons, and handsomely fitted up, though with high-pressure engines, which always conveyed that kind of feeling to me which I should be likely to experience, I think, if I had lodgings on the first floor of a powder mill. She was laden with flour, some casks of which commodity were stored upon the deck. The captain, coming up to have a little conversation and to introduce a friend, seated himself astride one of these barrels like a Bacchus of private life, and pulling a great clasp knife out of his pocket, began to whittle it as he talked, by paring thin slices off the edges. As he whittled it with such industry and hearty good will, that but for his being called away very soon it must have disappeared bodily, and left nothing in its place but grist and shavings. After calling at one or two flat places with low dams stretching out into the lake, whereon were stumpy lighthouses like windmills without sails, the whole looking like a Dutch vignette, we came at midnight to Cleveland, where we lay all night, and until 9 o'clock next morning. I entertained quite a curiosity in reference to this place, from having seen at Sandusky a specimen of its literature in the shape of a newspaper, which was very strong indeed upon the subject of Lord Ashburton's recent arrival at Washington to adjust the points in dispute between the United States Government and Great Britain, informing its readers that, as America had whipped England in her infancy, and whipped her again in her youth, so it was clearly necessary that she must whip her once again in her maturity, and pledging its credit to all true Americans that if Mr. Webster did his duty in the approaching negotiations, and sent the English lord home again in double quick time, they should within 2 years sing Yankee Doodle in Hyde Park, and Hail Columbia in the scarlet courts of Westminster. I found it a pretty town, and had the satisfaction of beholding the outside of the office of the journal from which I have just quoted. I did not enjoy the delight of seeing the wit who indited the paragraph in question, but I have no doubt he is a prodigious man in his way, and held in high repute by a select circle. There was a gentleman on board to whom, as I unintentionally learned through the thin partition which divided our state-room from the cabin in which he and his wife conversed together, I was unwittingly the occasion of very great uneasiness. I don't know why or wherefore, but I appeared to run in his mind perpetually, and to dissatisfy him very much. First of all I heard him say, and the most ludicrous part of the business was, that he said it in my very ear, and could not have communicated more directly with me if he had leaned upon my shoulder and whispered me, "Boz is on board still, my dear." After a considerable pause, he added complainingly, "Boz keeps himself very close," which was true enough, for I was not very well, and was lying down with a book. I thought he had done with me after this, but I was deceived, for a long interval having elapsed, during which I imagined him to have been turning restlessly from side to side, and trying to go to sleep, he broke out again with, "I suppose that Boz will be writing a book by and by, and putting all our names in it." At which imaginary consequence of being on board a boat with Boz, he groaned and became silent. We called at the town of Erie at 8 o'clock that night, and lay there an hour. Between 5 and 6 next morning we arrived at Buffalo, where we breakfasted, and being too near the Great Falls to wait patiently anywhere else, we set off by the train the same morning at 9 o'clock to Niagara. It was a miserable day, chilly and raw, a damp mist falling, and the trees in that northern region quite bare and wintry. Whenever the train halted, I listened for the roar, and was constantly straining my eyes in the direction where I knew the falls must be, from seeing the river rolling on towards them, every moment expecting to behold the spray. Within a few minutes of our stopping, not before, I saw 2 great white clouds rising up slowly and majestically from the depths of the earth. That was all. At length we alighted, and then for the first time I heard the mighty rush of water, and felt the ground tremble underneath my feet. The bank is very steep, and was slippery with rain and half melted ice. I hardly know how I got down, but I was soon at the bottom, and climbing, 2 English officers who were crossing and had joined me, over some broken rocks, deafened by the noise, half blinded by the spray, and wet to the skin. We were at the foot of the American Fall. I could see an immense torrent of water tearing headlong down from some great height, but had no idea of shape or situation or anything but vague immensity. When we were seated in the little ferry boat, and were crossing the swollen river immediately before both cataracts, I began to feel what it was, but I was in a manner stunned, and unable to comprehend the vastness of the scene. It was not until I came on Table Rock and looked, great heaven, on what a fall of bright green water, that it came upon me in its full might and majesty. Then when I felt how near to my Creator I was standing, the first effect, and the enduring one, instant and lasting, of the tremendous spectacle, peace of mind, tranquillity, calm recollections of the dead, great thoughts of eternal rest and happiness, nothing of gloom or terror. Niagara was at once stamped upon my heart, an image of beauty, to remain there, changeless and indelible, until its pulses ceased to beat for ever. Oh, how the strife and trouble of daily life receded from my view, and lessened in the distance, during the 10 memorable days we passed on that enchanted ground! What voices spoke from out the thundering water! What faces, faded from the earth, looked out upon me from its gleaming depths! What heavenly promise glistened in those angels' tears, the drops of many hues that showered around and twined themselves about the gorgeous arches which the changing rainbows made? I never stirred in all that time from the Canadian side, whither I had gone at first. I never crossed the river again, for I knew there were people on the other shore, and in such a place it is natural to shun strange company. To wander to and fro all day, and see the cataracts from all points of view, to stand upon the edge of the great horseshoe fall, marking the hurried water gathering strength as it approached the verge, yet seeming, too, to pause before it shot into the gulf below; to gaze from the river's level up at the torrent as it came streaming down; to climb the neighbouring heights and watch it through the trees, and see the wreathing water in the rapids hurrying on to take its fearful plunge; to linger in the shadow of the solemn rocks 3 miles below, watching the river as, stirred by no visible cause, it heaved and eddied and awoke the echoes, being troubled yet, far down beneath the surface, by its giant leap; to have Niagara before me, lighted by the sun and by the moon, red in the day's decline, and grey as evening slowly fell upon it; to look upon it every day, and wake up in the night and hear its ceaseless voice: this was enough. I think, in every quiet season now, still do those waters roll and leap, and roar and tumble all day long; still are the rainbows spanning them 100 feet below; still, when the sun is on them, do they shine and glow like molten gold; still, when the day is gloomy, do they fall like snow, or seem to crumble away like the front of a great chalk cliff, or roll down the rock like dense white smoke. But always does the mighty stream appear to die as it comes down, and always from its unfathomable grave arises that tremendous ghost of spray and mist which is never laid; which has haunted this place with the same dread solemnity since darkness brooded on the deep, and that first flood before the deluge, light, came rushing on creation at the word of God. End of chapter 14.
Section 17 of American Notes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bob Srigley, Charlottesville, Virginia. Chapter 15. In Canada: Toronto, Kingston, Monstreal, Quebec, St. John's. In the United States again: Lebanon, the Shaker Village, West Point. I wish to abstain from instituting any comparison or drawing any parallel whatever between the social features of the United States and those of the British possessions in Canada. For this reason I shall confine myself to a very brief account of our journeyings in the latter territory. But before I leave Niagara, I must advert to one disgusting circumstance which can hardly have escaped the observation of any decent traveller who has visited the Falls. On Table Rock there is a cottage belonging to a guide, where little relics of the place are sold, and where visitors register their names in a book kept for the purpose. On the wall of the room, in which a great many of these volumes are preserved, the following request is posted: Visitors will please not copy nor extract the remarks and poetical effusions from the registers and albums kept here. But for this intimation I should have let them lie upon the tables on which they were strewn with careful negligence, like books in a drawing room, being quite satisfied with the stupendous silliness of certain stanzas with an anticlimax at the end of each, which were framed and hung up on the wall. Curious, however, after reading this announcement, to see what kind of morsels were so carefully preserved, I turned a few leaves and found them scrawled all over with the vilest and filthiest ribaldry that ever human hogs delighted in. It is humiliating enough to know that there are among men brutes so obscene and worthless that they can delight in laying their miserable profanations upon the very steps of nature's greatest altar. But that these should be hoarded up for the delight of their fellow swine, and kept in a public place where any eyes may see them, is a disgrace to the English language in which they are written. though I hope few of these entries have been made by Englishmen, and a reproach to the English side on which they are preserved. The quarters of our soldiers at Niagara are finely and airily situated. Some of them are quite large detached houses on the plain above the falls, which were originally designed for hotels; and in the evening time, when the women and children were leaning over the balconies watching the men as they played at ball and other games upon the grass before the door, they often presented a little picture of cheerfulness and animation, which made it quite a pleasure to pass that way. At any garrisoned point where the line of demarcation between one country and another is so very narrow as at Niagara, desertion from the ranks can scarcely fail to be of frequent occurrence; and it may be reasonably supposed that when the soldiers entertain the wildest and maddest hopes of the fortune and independence that await them on the other side, the impulse to play traitor, which such a place suggests to dishonest minds, is not weakened. But it very rarely happens that the men who do desert are happy or contented afterwards, and many instances have been known in which they have confessed their grievous disappointment, and their earnest desire to return to their old service, if they could but be assured of pardon or lenient treatment. Many of their comrades, notwithstanding, do the like from time to time, and instances of loss of life in the effort across the river with this object are far from being uncommon. Several men were drowned in the attempt to swim across not long ago, and one, who had the madness to trust himself upon a table as a raft, was swept down to the whirlpool, where his mangled body eddied round and round some days. I am inclined to think that the noise of the falls is very much exaggerated, and this will appear the more probable when the depth of the great basin in which the water is received is taken into account. At no time during our stay there was the wind at all high or boisterous, but we never heard them 3 miles off, even at the very quiet time of sunset, though we often tried. Queenston, at which place the steamboats start for Toronto, or I should rather say at which place they call, for their wharf is at Lewiston on the opposite shore, is situated in a delicious valley through which the Niagara River, in colour a very deep green, pursues its course. It is approached by a road that takes its winding way among the heights by which the town is sheltered, and seen from this point is extremely beautiful and picturesque. On the most conspicuous of these heights stood a monument erected by the provincial legislature in memory of General Brock, who was slain in a battle with the American forces, after having won the victory. Some vagabond, supposed to be a fellow of the name of Litt, who is now or lately was in prison as a felon, blew up this monument 2 years ago, and it is now a melancholy ruin, with a long fragment of iron railing hanging dejectedly from its top, and waving to and fro like a wild ivy branch or broken vine stem. It is of much higher importance than it may seem that this statue should be repaired at the public cost, as it ought to have been long ago. Firstly, because it is beneath the dignity of England to allow a memorial raised in honour of one of her defenders to remain in this condition on the very spot where he died. Secondly, because the sight of it in its present state, and the recollection of the unpunished outrage which brought it to this pass, is not very likely to soothe down border feelings among English subjects here, or compose their border quarrels and dislikes. I was standing on the wharf at this place, watching the passengers embarking in a steamboat which preceded that whose coming we awaited, and participating in the anxiety with which a sergeant's wife was collecting her few goods together, keeping one distracted eye hard upon the porters who were hurrying them on board, and the other on a hoopless washing tub, for which, as being the most utterly worthless of all her movables, she seemed to entertain particular affection, when 3 or 4 soldiers with a recruit came up and went on board. The recruit was a likely young fellow enough, strongly built and well made, but by no means sober. Indeed, he had all the air of a man who had been more or less drunk for some days. He carried a small bundle over his shoulder, slung at the end of a walking stick, and had a short pipe in his mouth. He was as dusty and dirty as recruits usually are, and his shoes betokened that he had travelled on foot some distance. But he was in a very jocose state, and shook hands with this soldier, and clapped that one on the back, and talked and laughed continually, like a roaring idle dog as he was. The soldiers rather laughed at this blade than with him, seeming to say, as they stood straightening their canes in their hands, and looking coolly at him over their glazed stocks, "Go on, my boy, while you may. You'll know better by and by." When suddenly the novice, who had been backing towards the gangway in his noisy merriment, fell overboard before their eyes, and splashed heavily down into the river between the vessel and the dock. I never saw such a good thing as the change that came over these soldiers in an instant. Almost before the man was down, their professional manner, their stiffness and constraint, were gone, and they were filled with the most violent energy. In less time than is required to tell it, they had him out again, feet first, with the tails of his coat flapping over his eyes, everything about him hanging the wrong way, and the water streaming off at every thread in his threadbare dress. But the moment they set him upright, and found that he was none the worse, they were soldiers again, looking over their glazed stocks more composedly than ever. The half-sobered recruit glanced round for a moment, as if his first impulse were to express some gratitude for his preservation, but seeing them with this air of total unconcern, and having his wet pipe presented to him with an oath by the soldier who had been by far the most anxious of the party, he stuck it in his mouth, thrust his hands into his moist pockets, and, without even shaking the water off his clothes, walked on board whistling, not to say as if nothing had happened, but as if he had meant to do it, and it had been a perfect success. Our steamboat came up directly this had left the wharf, and soon bore us to the mouth of the Niagara, where the stars and stripes of America flutter on one side, and the Union Jack of England on the other, and so narrow is the space between them that the sentinels in either fort can often hear the watchword of the other country given. Thence we emerged on Lake Ontario, an inland sea, and by 6:30 o'clock were at Toronto. The country round this town, being very flat, is bare of scenic interest, but the town itself is full of life and motion, bustle, business, and improvement. The streets are well paved and lighted with gas, the houses are large and good, the shops excellent. Many of them have a display of goods in their windows such as may be seen in thriving country towns in England, and there are some which would do no discredit to the metropolis itself. There is a good stone prison here, and there are besides a handsome church, a courthouse, public offices, many commodious private residences, and a government observatory for noting and recording the magnetic variations. In the College of Upper Canada, which is one of the public establishments of the city, a sound education in every department of polite learning can be had at a very moderate expense, the annual charge for the instruction of each pupil not exceeding £9 sterling. It has pretty good endowments in the way of land, and is a valuable and useful institution. The first stone of a new college had been laid but a few days before by the Governor-General. It will be a handsome spacious edifice, approached by a long avenue, which is already planted and made available as a public walk. The town is well adapted for wholesome exercise at all seasons, for the footways in the thoroughfares, which lie beyond the principal street, are planked like floors, and kept in very good and clean repair. It is a matter of deep regret that political differences should have run high in this place, and led to most discreditable and disgraceful results. It is not long since guns were discharged from a window in this town at the successful candidates in an election, and the coachman of one of them was actually shot in the body, though not dangerously wounded. But one man was killed on the same occasion, and from this very window whence he received his death, the very flag which shielded his murderer, not only in the commission of his crime, but from its consequences, was displayed again on the occasion of the public ceremony performed by the Governor-General, to which I have just adverted. Of all the colours in the rainbow, there is but one which could be so employed. I need not say that flag was orange. The time of leaving Toronto for Kingston is noon. By 8 o'clock next morning the traveller is at the end of his journey, which is performed by steamboat upon Lake Ontario, calling at Port Hope and Cobourg, the latter a cheerful, thriving little town. Vast quantities of flour form the chief item in the freight of these vessels. We had no fewer than 1,080 barrels on board between Cobourg and Kingston. The latter place, which is now the seat of government in Canada, is a very poor town, rendered still poorer in the appearance of its market-place by the ravages of a recent fire. Indeed, it may be said of Kingston that one half of it appears to be burnt down, and the other half not to be built up. The government house is neither elegant nor commodious, yet it is almost the only house of any importance in the neighbourhood. There is an admirable jail here, well and wisely governed, and excellently regulated in every respect. The men were employed as shoemakers, rope makers, blacksmiths, tailors, carpenters, and stone cutters, and in building a new prison, which was pretty far advanced toward completion. The female prisoners were occupied in needlework. Among them was a beautiful girl of 20, who had been there nearly 3 years. She acted as bearer of secret dispatches for the self-styled patriots on Navy Island during the Canadian insurrection, sometimes dressing as a girl and carrying them in her stays, sometimes attiring herself as a boy and secreting them in the lining of her hat. In the latter character she always rode as a boy would, which was nothing to her, for she could govern any horse that any man could ride, and could drive four in hand with the best whip in those parts. Setting forth on one of her patriotic missions, she appropriated to herself the first horse she could lay her hands on, and this offence had brought her where I saw her. She had quite a lovely face, though, as the reader may suppose from this sketch of her history, there was a lurking devil in her bright eye, which looked out pretty sharply from between her prison bars. There is a bomb-proof fort here of great strength, which occupies a bold position, and is capable doubtless of doing good service, though the town is much too close upon the frontier to be long held, I should imagine, for its present purpose in troubled times. There is also a small navy yard, where a couple of government steamboats were building, and getting on vigorously. We left Kingston for Monstreal on the 10th of May at 9:30 in the morning, and proceeded in a steamboat down the St. Lawrence River. The beauty of this noble stream at almost any point, but especially in the commencement of this journey, when it winds its way among the 1,000 islands, can hardly be imagined. The number and constant successions of these islands, all green and richly wooded, their fluctuating sizes, some so large that for half an hour together one among them will appear as the opposite bank of the river, and some so small that they are mere dimples on its broad bosom, their infinite variety of shapes, and the numberless combinations of beautiful forms which the trees growing on them present, all form a picture fraught with uncommon interest and pleasure. In the afternoon we shot down some rapids, where the river boiled and bubbled strangely, and where the force and headlong violence of the current were tremendous. At 7 o'clock we reached Dickinson's Landing, whence travellers proceed for 2 or 3 hours by stage-coach, the navigation of the river being rendered so dangerous and difficult in the interval by rapids, that steamboats do not make the passage. The number and length of those portages over which the roads are bad, and the travelling slow, render the way between the towns of Monstreal and Kingston somewhat tedious. Our course lay over a wide unenclosed tract of country at a little distance from the riverside, whence the bright warning lights on the dangerous parts of the St. Lawrence shone vividly. The night was dark and raw, and the way dreary enough. It was nearly 10 o'clock when we reached the wharf where the next steamboat lay, and went on board and to bed. She lay there all night, and started as soon as it was day. The morning was ushered in by a violent thunderstorm, and was very wet, but gradually improved and brightened up. Going on deck after breakfast, I was amazed to see floating down with the stream a most gigantic raft, with some 30 or 40 wooden houses upon it, and at least as many flag masts, so that it looked like a nautical street. I saw many of these rafts afterward, but never one so large. All the timber, or lumber as it is called in America, which is brought down the St. Lawrence, is floated down in this manner. When the raft reaches its place of destination, it is broken up, the materials are sold, and the boatmen return for more. At 8 we landed again, and travelled by a stage-coach for 4 hours through a pleasant and well-cultivated country, perfectly French in every respect, in the appearance of the cottages, the air, language, and dress of the peasantry, the sign-boards on the shops and taverns, and the Virgin's shrines and crosses by the wayside. Nearly every common labourer and boy, though he had no shoes to his feet, wore round his waist a sash of some bright colour, generally red, and the women who were working in the fields and gardens, and doing all kinds of husbandry, wore, one and all, great flat straw hats with most capacious brims. There were Catholic priests and sisters of charity in the village streets, and images of the Saviour at the corners of crossroads, and in other public places. At noon we went on board another steamboat, and reached the village of Lachine, 9 miles from Monstreal, by 3 o'clock. There we left the river, and went on by land. Monstreal is pleasantly situated on the margin of the St. Lawrence, and is backed by some bold heights, about which there are charming rides and drives. The streets are generally narrow and irregular, as in most French towns of any age, but in the more modern parts of the city they are wide and airy. They display a great variety of very good shops, and both in the town and suburbs there are many excellent private dwellings. The granite quays are remarkable for their beauty, solidity, and extent. There is a very large Catholic cathedral here, recently erected, with 2 tall spires, of which one is yet unfinished. In the open space in front of this edifice stands a solitary grim-looking square brick tower, which has a quaint and remarkable appearance, and which the wiseacres of the place have consequently determined to pull down immediately. The Government House is very superior to that at Kingston, and the town is full of life and bustle. In one of the suburbs is a plank road, not footpath, 5 or 6 miles long, and a famous road it is too. All the rides in the vicinity were made doubly interesting by the bursting out of spring, which is here so rapid that it is but a day's leap from barren winter to the blooming youth of summer. The steamboats to Quebec perform the journey in the night, that is to say, they leave Montreal at 6 in the evening, and arrive at Quebec at 6 the next morning. We made this excursion during our stay in Montreal, which exceeded a fortnight, and were charmed by its interest and beauty. The impression made upon the visitor by this Gibraltar of America, its giddy heights, its citadel suspended as it were in the air, its picturesque steep streets and frowning gateways, and the splendid views which burst upon the eye at every turn, is at once unique and lasting. It is a place not to be forgotten, or mixed up in the mind with other places, or altered for a moment in the crowd of scenes a traveller can recall. Apart from the realities of this most picturesque city, there are associations clustering about it which would make a desert rich in interest. The dangerous precipice along whose rocky front Wolfe and his brave companions climbed to glory, the plains of Abraham where he received his mortal wound, the fortress so chivalrously defended by Montcalm and his soldier's grave, dug for him while yet alive by the bursting of a shell, are not the least among them, or among the gallant incidents of history. There is a noble monument too, and worthy of 2 great nations, which perpetuates the memory of both brave generals, and on which their names are jointly written. The city is rich in public institutions, and in Catholic churches and charities, but it is mainly in the prospect from the site of the old Government House, and from the citadel, that its surpassing beauty lies. The exquisite expanse of country, rich in field and forest, mountain height and water, which lies stretched out here before the view, with miles of Canadian villages glancing in long white streaks like veins along the landscape, the motley crowd of gables, roofs, and chimney tops in the old hilly town immediately at hand, the beautiful St. Lawrence sparkling and flashing in the sunlight, and the tiny ships below the rock from which you gaze, whose distant rigging looks like spiders' webs against the light, while casks and barrels on their decks dwindle into toys, and busy mariners become so many puppets. All this, framed by a sunken window in the fortress, and looked at from the shadowed room within, forms one of the brightest and most enchanting pictures that the eye can rest upon. In the spring of the year, vast numbers of emigrants who have newly arrived from England or from Ireland pass between Quebec and Monstreal on their way to the backwoods and new settlements of Canada. If it can be an entertaining lounge, as I very often found it, to take a morning stroll upon the quay at Monstreal, and see them grouped in hundreds on the public wharfs about their chests and boxes, it is a matter of deep interest to be their fellow passenger on one of these steamboats, and mingling with the concourse, see and hear them unobserved. The vessel in which we returned from Quebec to Monstreal was crowded with them, and at night they spread their beds between the decks, those who had beds at least, and slept so close and thick about our cabin door that the passage to and fro was quite blocked up. They were nearly all English, from Gloucestershire the greater part, and had had a long winter passage out, but it was wonderful to see how clean the children had been kept, and how untiring in their love and self-denial all the poor parents were. Cant as we may, and as we shall to the end of all things, it is very much harder for the poor to be virtuous than it is for the rich, and the good that is in them shines the brighter for it. In many a noble mansion lives a man, the best of husbands and of fathers, whose private worth in both capacities is justly lauded to the skies. But bring him here, upon this crowded deck, strip from his fair young wife her silken dress and jewels, unbind her braided hair, stamp early wrinkles on her brow, pinch her pale cheek with care and much privation, array her faded form in coarsely patched attire, let there be nothing but his love to set her forth or deck her out, and you shall put it to the proof indeed. So change his station in the world, that he shall see in those young things who climb about his knee, not records of his wealth and name, but little wrestlers with him for his daily bread. So many poachers on his scanty meal, so many units to divide his every sum of comfort, and farther to reduce its small amount. In lieu of the endearments of childhood in its sweetest aspect, heap upon him all its pains and wants, its sicknesses and ills, its fretfulness, caprice, and querulous endurance. Let its prattle be not of engaging infant fancies, but of cold and thirst and hunger. And if his fatherly affection outlive all this, and he be patient, watchful, tender, careful of his children's lives, and mindful always of their joys and sorrows, then send him back to Parliament and pulpit and to quarter sessions, and when he hears fine talk of the depravity of those who live from hand to mouth, and labour hard to do it, let him speak up as one who knows, and tell those holders forth that they, by parallel with such a class, should be high angels in their daily lives, and lay but humble siege to heaven at last. Which of us shall say that he would be, if such realities with small relief or change all through his days were his? Looking round upon these people, far from home, houseless, indigent, wandering, weary with travel and hard living, and seeing how patiently they nursed and tended their young children, how they consulted ever their wants first, then half supplied their own, what gentle ministers of hope and faith the women were, how the men profited by their example, and how very, very seldom even a moment's pestilence or harsh complaint broke out among them, I felt a stronger love and honour of my kind come glowing on my heart, and wished to God there had been many atheists in the better part of human nature there to read this simple lesson in the book of life. We left Monstreal for New York again on the 30th of May, crossing to La Prairie on the opposite side of the St. Lawrence in a steamboat. We then took the railroad to St. John's, which is on the brink of Lake Champlain. Our last greeting in Canada was from the English officers in the pleasant barracks at that place, a class of gentlemen who had made every hour of our visit memorable by their hospitality and friendship, and with Rule Britannica sounding in our ears, soon left it far behind. But Canada has held, and always will retain, a foremost place in my remembrance. Few Englishmen are prepared to find it what it is, advancing quietly, old differences settling down, and being fast forgotten, public feeling and private enterprise alike in a sound and wholesome state, nothing of flush or fever in its system, but health and vigour throbbing in its steady pulse. It is full of hope and promise. To me, who had been accustomed to think of it as something left behind in the strides of advancing society, as something neglected and forgotten, slumbering and wasting in its sleep, the demand for labour and the rates of wages, the busy quays of Montreal, the vessels taking in their cargoes and discharging them, the amount of shipping in the different ports, the commerce, roads, and public works, all made to last, the respectability and character of the public journals, and the amount of rational comfort and happiness which honest industry may earn, were very great surprises. The steamboats on the lakes, in their conveniences, cleanliness, and safety, in the gentlemanly character and bearing of their captains, and in the politeness and perfect comfort of their social regulations, are unsurpassed even by the famous Scotch vessels deservedly so much esteemed at home. The inns are usually bad, because the custom of boarding at hotels is not so general here as in the States, and the British officers, who form a large portion of the society of every town, live chiefly at the regimental messes. But in every other respect the traveller in Canada will find as good provision for his comfort as in any place I know. There is one American boat, the vessel which carried us on Lake Champlain from St. John's to Whitehall, which I praise very highly, but no more than it deserves, when I say that it is superior even to that in which we went from Queenston to Toronto, or to that in which we travelled from the latter place to Kingston, or, I have no doubt, I may add to any other in the world. The steamboat, which is called the Burlington, is a perfectly exquisite achievement of neatness, elegance, and order. The decks are drawing rooms, the cabins are boudoirs, choicely furnished and adorned with prints, pictures, and musical instruments. Every nook and corner in the vessel is a perfect curiosity of graceful comfort and beautiful contrivance. Captain Sherman, her commander, to whose ingenuity and excellent taste these results are solely attributable, has bravely and worthily distinguished himself on more than one trying occasion, not least among them in having the moral courage to carry British troops at a time, during the Canadian Rebellion, when no other convenience was open to them. He and his vessels are held in universal respect both by his own countrymen and ours, and no man ever enjoyed the popular esteem who in his sphere of action won and wore it better than this gentleman. By means of this floating palace we were soon in the United States again, and called that evening at Burlington, a pretty town, where we lay an hour or so. We reached Whitehall, where we were to disembark at 6 next morning, and might have done so earlier, that these steamboats lie by for some hours in the night, in consequence of the lake becoming very narrow at that part of the journey, and difficult of navigation in the dark. Its width is so contracted at one point indeed, that they are obliged to warp round by means of a rope. After breakfasting at Whitehall, we took the stage-coach for Albany, a large and busy town, where we arrived between 5 and 6 that afternoon, after a very hot day's journey, for we were now in the height of summer again. At 7 we started for New York on board a great North River steamboat, which was so crowded with passengers that the upper deck was like the box lobby of a theatre between the pieces, and the lower one like Tottenham Court Road on a Saturday night. But we slept soundly notwithstanding, and soon after 5 o'clock next morning reached New York. Tarrying here only that day and night to recruit after our late fatigues, we started off once more upon our last journey in America. We had yet 5 days to spare before embarking for England, and I had a great desire to see the Shaker village, which is peopled by a religious sect from whom it takes its name. To this end we went up the North River again as far as the town of Hudson, and there hired an extra to carry us to Lebanon, 30 miles distant, and of course another and a different Lebanon from that village where I slept on the night of the Prairie trip. The country through which the road meandered was rich and beautiful, the weather very fine, and for many miles the Catskill Mountains, where Rip Van Winkle and the ghostly Dutchman played at ninepins one memorable gusty afternoon, towered in the blue distance like stately clouds. At one point, as we ascended a steep hill, athwart whose base a railroad yet constructing took its course, we came upon an Irish colony. With means at hand of building decent cabins, it was wonderful to see how clumsy, rough, and wretched its hovels were. The best were poor protection from the weather, the worst let in the wind and rain through wide breaches in the roofs of sodden grass and in the walls of mud. Some had neither door nor window, some had nearly fallen down, and were imperfectly propped up by stakes and poles. All were ruinous and filthy. Hideously ugly old women and very buxom young ones, pigs, dogs, men, children, babies, pots, kettles, dunghills, vile refuse, rank straw, and standing water, all wallowing together in an inseparable heap, composed the furniture of every dark and dirty hut. Between 9 and 10 o'clock at night we arrived at Lebanon, which is renowned for its warm baths, and for a great hotel, well adapted, I have no doubt, to the gregarious taste of those seekers after health or pleasure who repair here, but inexpressibly comfortless to me. We were shown into an immense apartment, lighted by 2 dim candles, called the drawing room, from which there was a descent by a flight of steps to another vast desert called the dining room. Our bedchambers were among certain long rows of little whitewashed cells, which opened from either side of a dreary passage, and were so like rooms in a prison that I half expected to be locked up when I went to bed, and listened involuntarily for the turning of the key on the outside. There need be baths somewhere in the neighbourhood, for the other washing arrangements were on as limited a scale as ever I saw, even in America. Indeed, these bedrooms were so very bare of even such common luxuries as chairs, that I should say they were not provided with enough of anything, but that I bethink myself of our having been most bountifully bitten all night. The house is very pleasantly situated, however, and we had a good breakfast. That done, we went to visit our place of destination, which was some 2 miles off, and the way to which was soon indicated by a finger post whereon was painted, "To the Shaker village." As we rode along, we passed a party of Shakers who were at work upon the road, who wore the broadest of all broad-brimmed hats, and were in all visible respects such very wooden men, that I felt about as much sympathy for them, and as much interest in them, as if they had been so many figureheads of ships. Presently we came to the beginning of the village, and alighting at the door of a house where the Shaker manufactures are sold, and which is the headquarters of the elders, requested permission to see the Shaker worship. Pending the conveyance of this request to some person in authority, we walked into a grim room, where several grim hats were hanging on grim pegs, and the time was grimly told by a grim clock, which uttered every tick with a kind of struggle, as if it broke the grim silence reluctantly and under protest. Ranged against the wall were 6 or 8 stiff, high-backed chairs, and they partook so strongly of the general grimness, that one would much rather have sat on the floor than incurred the smallest obligation to any of them. Presently there stalked into this apartment a grim old Shaker, with eyes as hard and dull and cold as the great round metal buttons on his coat and waistcoat, a sort of calm goblin. Being informed of our desire, he produced a newspaper wherein the body of elders whereof he was a member had advertised but a few days before, that in consequence of certain unseemly interruptions which their worship had received from strangers, their chapel was closed to the public for the space of 1 year. As nothing was to be urged in opposition to this reasonable arrangement, we requested leave to make some trifling purchases of Shaker goods, which was grimly conceded. We accordingly repaired to a store in the same house and on the opposite side of the passage, where the stock was presided over by something alive in a russet case, which the elder said was a woman, and which I suppose was a woman, though I should not have suspected it. On the opposite side of the road was their place of worship, a cool green edifice of wood, with large windows and green blinds, like a spacious summer house. As there was no getting into this place, and nothing was to be done but walk up and down and look at it and the other buildings in the village, which were chiefly of wood, painted a dark red, like English barns, and composed of many stories, like English factories, I have nothing to communicate to the reader beyond the scanty results I gleaned the while our purchases were making. These people are called Shakers from their peculiar form of adoration, which consists of a dance performed by the men and women of all ages, who arrange themselves for that purpose in opposite parties, the men first divesting themselves of their hats and coats, which they gravely hang against the wall before they begin, and tying a ribbon round their shirt sleeves as though they were going to be bled, they accompany themselves with a droning humming noise, and dance until they are quite exhausted, alternately advancing and retiring in a preposterous sort of trot. The effect is said to be unspeakably absurd, and if I may judge from a print of this ceremony which I have in my possession, and which I am informed by those who have visited the chapel is perfectly accurate, it must be infinitely grotesque. They are governed by a woman, and her rule is understood to be absolute, though she has the assistance of a council of elders. She lives, it is said, in strict seclusion in certain rooms above the chapel, and is never shown to profane eyes. If she at all resemble the lady who presided over the store, it is a great charity to keep her as close as possible, and I cannot too strongly express my perfect concurrence in this benevolent proceeding. All the possessions and revenues of the settlement are thrown into a common stock, which is managed by the elders. As they have made converts among people who were well-to-do in the world, and are frugal and thrifty, it is understood that this fund prospers, the more especially as they have made large purchases of land. Nor is this at Lebanon the only Shaker settlement. There are, I think, at least 3 others. They are good farmers, and all their produce is eagerly purchased and highly esteemed. Shaker seeds, Shaker herbs, Shaker distilled waters, are commonly announced for sale in the shops of towns and cities. They are good breeders of cattle, and are kind and merciful to the brute creation. Consequently, Shaker beasts seldom fail to find a ready market. They eat and drink together after the Spartan model at a great public table. There is no union of the sexes, and every Shaker, male and female, is devoted to a life of celibacy. Rumour has been busy upon this theme, but here again I must refer to the lady of the store, and say, that if many of the sister Shakers resemble her, I treat all such slander as bearing on its face the strongest marks of wild improbability. But that they take as proselytes persons so young that they cannot know their own minds, and cannot possess much strength of resolution in this or any other respect, I can assert from my own observation of the extreme juvenility of certain youthful Shakers whom I saw at work upon the party on the road. They are said to be good drivers of bargains, but to be honest and just in their transactions. and even in horse dealing to resist those thievish tendencies which would seem, for some undiscovered reason, to be almost inseparable from that branch of traffic. In all matters they hold their own course quietly, live in their gloomy, silent commonwealth, and show little desire to interfere with other people. This is well enough, but nevertheless I cannot, I confess, incline toward the Shakers, view them with much favour, or extend towards them any very lenient construction. I so abhor, and from my soul detest, that bad spirit, no matter by what class or sect it may be entertained, which would strip life of its healthful graces, rob youth of its innocent pleasures, pluck from maturity and age their pleasant ornaments, and make existence but a narrow path towards the grave. That odious spirit which, if it could have had full scope and sway upon the earth, must have blasted and made barren the imaginations of the greatest men, and left them in their power of raising up enduring images before their fellow creatures yet unborn, no better than the beast. That in these very broad-brimmed hats and very sombre coats, in stiff-necked, solemn-visaged piety, in short, no matter what its garb, whether it have cropped hair, as in a Shaker village, or long nails, as in a Hindoo temple, I recognize the worst among the enemies of heaven and earth, who turn the water at the marriage feast of this poor world not into wine but gall. And if there must be people vowed to crush the harmless fancies and the love of innocent delights and gaieties, which are a part of human nature, as much a part of it as any other love or hope that is our common portion, let them for me stand openly revealed among the ribald and licentious. The very idiots know that they are not on the immortal road, and will despise them and avoid them readily. Leaving the Shaker village with a hearty dislike of the old Shakers, and a hearty pity for the young ones, tempered by the strong probability of their running away as they grow older and wiser, which they not uncommonly do, we returned to Lebanon, and so to Hudson, by the way we had come upon the previous day. There we took the steamboat down the North River towards New York, but stopped some 4 hours' journey short of it at West Point, where we remained that night and all next day, and next night too. In this beautiful place, the fairest among the fair and lovely highlands of the North River, shut in by deep green heights and ruined forts, and looking down upon the distant town of Newburgh, along a glittering path of sunlit water, with here and there a skiff, whose white sail often bends on some new tack as sudden flaws of wind come down upon her from the gullies and the hills, hemmed in besides all round with memories of Washington and events of the Revolutionary War, is the Military School of America. It could not stand on more appropriate ground, and any ground more beautiful can hardly be. The course of education is severe, but well devised and manly. Through June, July, and August, the young men encamp upon the spacious plain whereon the college stands, and all the year their military exercises are performed there daily. The term of study of this institution, which the state requires from all cadets, is 4 years, but whether it be from the rigid nature of the discipline, or the national impatience of restraint, or both causes combined, not more than half the number who begin their studies here ever remain to finish them. The number of cadets being about equal to that of the numbers of Congress, one is sent here from every congressional district, its member influencing the selection. Commissions in the service are distributed on the same principle. The dwellings of the various professors are beautifully situated, and there is a most excellent hotel for strangers, though it has the 2 drawbacks of being a total abstinence house, wines and spirits being forbidden to the students, and of serving the public meals at rather uncomfortable hours, to wit, breakfast at 7, dinner at 1, and supper at sunset. The beauty and freshness of this calm retreat in the very dawn and greenness of summer, it was then the beginning of June, were exquisite indeed. Leaving it upon the 6th, and returning to New York to embark for England on the succeeding day, I was glad to think that among the last memorable beauties which had glided past us and softened in the bright perspective, were those whose pictures, traced by no common hand, are fresh in most men's minds, not easily to grow old or fade beneath the dust of time: the Catskill Mountains, Sleepy Hollow, and the Tappan Zee. End of Section 17. Chapter 15. Reading by Bob Srigley, Charlottesville, Virginia.
Section 18 of American Notes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denny Sayers in Modesto, California. American Notes by Charles Dickens. Chapter 16. The Passage Home. I never had so much interest before, and very likely I shall never have so much interest again, in the state of the wind, as on the long-looked-for morning of Tuesday the 7th of June. Some nautical authority had told me a day or two previous, anything with west in it will do. So when I darted out of bed at daylight, and throwing up the window, was saluted by a lively breeze from the northwest, which had sprung up in the night, it came upon me so freshly, rustling with so many happy associations, that I conceived upon the spot a special regard for all airs blowing from that quarter of the compass, which I shall cherish, I dare say, until my own wind has breathed its last frail puff, and withdrawn itself for ever from the mortal calendar. The pilot had not been slow to take advantage of this favorable weather, and the ship, which yesterday had been in such a crowded dock that she might have retired from trade for good and all, for any chance she seemed to have of going to sea, was now full 16 miles away. A gallant sight she was, when we, fast gaining on her in a steamboat, saw her in the distance riding at anchor, her tall masts pointing up in graceful lines against the sky, and every rope and spar expressed in delicate and thread-like outline. Gallant, too, when, we being all aboard, the anchor came up to the sturdy chorus, "Cheerily, men, oh, cheerily!" and she followed proudly in the towing steamboat's wake. But bravest and most gallant of all, when the tow-rope being cast adrift, the canvas fluttered from her masts, and spreading her white wings, she soared away upon her free and solitary course. In the after cabin we were only 15 passengers in all, and the greater part were from Canada, where some of us had known each other. The night was rough and squally, so were the next 2 days, but they flew by quickly, and we were soon as cheerful and snug a party, with an honest, manly-hearted captain at our head, as ever came to the resolution of being mutually agreeable, on land or water. We breakfasted at 8, lunched at 12, dined at 3, and took our tea at 7:30. We had abundance of amusements, and dinner was not the least among them. Firstly, for its own sake; secondly, because of its extraordinary length, its duration, inclusive of all the long pauses between the courses, being seldom less than 2 hours and a half, which was a subject of never-failing entertainment. By way of beguiling the tediousness of these banquets, a select association was formed at the lower end of the table, below the mast, to whose distinguished president modesty forbids me to make any further allusion, which, being a very hilarious and jovial institution, was, prejudice apart, in high favor with the rest of the community, and particularly with a black steward, who lived for 3 weeks in a broad grin at the marvellous humor of these incorporated worthies. Then we had chess for those who played it, whist, cribbage, books, backgammon, and shovel-board. In all weathers, fair or foul, calm or windy, we were every one on deck, walking up and down in pairs, lying in the boats, leaning over the side, or chatting in a lazy group together. We had no lack of music, for one played the accordion, another the violin, and another, who usually began at 6 o'clock a.m., the key bugle, the combined effect of which instruments, when they all played different tunes in different parts of the ship at the same time, and within hearing of each other, as they sometimes did, everybody being intensely satisfied with his own performance, was sublimely hideous. When all these means of entertainment failed, a sail would heave in sight, looming perhaps the very spirit of a ship in the misty distance, or passing us so close that through our glasses we could see the people on her decks, and easily make out her name, and whither she was bound. For hours together we could watch the dolphins and porpoises as they rolled and leaped and dived around the vessel, or those small creatures over on the wing, the Mother Carey's chickens, which had borne us company from New York Bay, and for a whole fortnight fluttered around the vessel's stern. For some days we had a dead calm, or very light winds, during which the crew amused themselves with fishing, and hooked an unlucky dolphin, who expired in all his rainbow colors on the deck, an event of such importance in our barren calendar that afterwards we dated from the dolphin, and made the day on which he died an era. Besides all this, when we were 5 or 6 days out, there began to be much talk of icebergs, of which wandering islands, an unusual number of which had been seen by the vessels that had come into New York a day or two before we left that port, and of whose dangerous neighborhood we were warned by the sudden coldness of the weather and the sinking of the mercury in the barometer. While these tokens lasted, a double lookout was kept, and many dismal tales were whispered after dark, of ships that had struck upon the ice and gone down in the night. But the wind obliging us to hold a southward course, we saw none of them, and the weather soon grew bright and warm again. The observation every day at noon, and the subsequent working of the vessel's course, was, as may be supposed, a feature in our lives of paramount importance, nor were there wanting, as there never are, sagacious doubters of the captain's calculations, who, so soon as his back was turned, would, in the absence of compasses, measure the chart with bits of string, and ends of pocket-handkerchiefs, and points of snuffers, and clearly prove him to be wrong by an odd 1,000 miles or so. It was very edifying to see these unbelievers shake their heads and frown, and hear them hold forth strongly upon navigation, not that they knew anything about it, but that they always mistrusted the captain in calm weather, or when the wind was adverse. Indeed, the mercury itself is not so variable as this class of passengers, whom you will see, when the ship is going nobly through the water, quite pale with admiration, swearing that the captain beats all captains ever known, and even hinting at subscriptions for a piece of plate; and who next morning, when the breeze was lulled, and all the sails hang useless in the idle air, shake their despondent heads again, and say, with screwed-up lips, they hope that captain is a sailor, but they shrewdly doubt him. It even became an occupation in the calm to wonder when the wind would spring up in favorable quarter, where it was clearly shown by all the rules and precedents it ought to have sprung up long ago. The first mate, who whistled for it zealously, was much respected for his perseverance, and was regarded even by the unbelievers as a first-rate sailor. Many gloomy looks would be cast upward through the cabin skylights at the flapping sails while dinner was in progress, and some, growing bold in ruefulness, predicted that we should land about the middle of July. There are always on board ship a sanguine one and a despondent one. The latter character carried it hollow at this period of the voyage, and triumphed over the sanguine one at every meal, by inquiring where he supposed the Great Western, which left New York a week after us, was now, and where he supposed the Cunard steam packet was now, and what he thought of sailing vessels as compared with steamships now, and so beset his life with pestilent attacks of that kind, that he too was obliged to affect despondency for very peace and quietude. These were additions to the list of entertaining incidents, but there was still another source of interest. We carried in the steerage nearly 100 passengers, a little world of poverty, and as we came to know individuals among them by sight, from looking down upon the deck where they took the air in the daytime, and cooked their food, and very often ate it too, we became curious to know their histories, and with what expectations they had gone out to America, and on what errands they were going home, and what their circumstances were. The information we got on these heads from the carpenter, who had charge of these people, was often of the strangest kind. Some of them had been in America but 3 days, some but 3 months, and some had gone out in the last voyage of that very ship in which they were now returning home. Others had sold their clothes to raise the passage money, and had hardly rags to cover them. Others had no food, and lived upon the charity of the rest, and one man, it was discovered, nearly at the end of the voyage, not before, for he kept his secret close, and did not court compassion, had had no substance whatever but the bones and scraps of fat he took from the plates used in the after-cabin dinner, when they were put out to be washed. The whole system of shipping and conveying these unfortunate persons is one that stands in need of thorough revision. If any class deserve to be protected and assisted by the government, it is that class who are banished from their native land in search of the bare means of subsistence. All that could be done for these poor people by the great compassion and humanity of the captain and officers was done, but they require much more. The law is bound, at least upon the English side, to see that too many of them are not put on board one ship, and that their accommodations are decent, not demoralizing and profligate. It is bound, too, in common humanity, to declare that no man shall be taken on board without his stock of provisions being previously inspected by some proper officer, and pronounced moderately sufficient for his support upon the voyage. It is bound to provide, or to require that there be provided, a medical attendant, whereas in these ships there are none, though sickness of adults and deaths of children on the passage are matters of the very commonest occurrence. Above all, it is the duty of any government, be it monarchy or republic, to interpose and put an end to that system by which a firm of traders and immigrants purchase of the owners the whole 'tween decks of a ship, and send on board as many wretched people as they can lay hold of, on any terms they can get, without the smallest reference to the conveniences of the steerage, the number of berths, the slightest separation of the sexes, or anything but their own immediate profit. Nor is even this the worst of the vicious system, for certain crimping agents of these houses, who have a percentage on all the passengers they inveigle, are constantly travelling about those districts where poverty and discontent are rife, and tempting the credulous into more misery by holding out monstrous inducements to emigration, which can never be realized. The history of every family we had on board was pretty much the same. After hoarding up, and borrowing, and begging, and selling everything to pay the passage, they had gone out to New York, expecting to find its streets paved with gold, and had found them paved with very hard and very real stones. Enterprise was dull. Laborers were not wanted. Jobs of work were to be got, but the payment was not. They were coming back even poorer than they went. One of them was carrying an open letter from a young English artisan, who had been in New York a fortnight, to a friend near Manchester, whom he strongly urged to follow him. One of the officers brought it to me as a curiosity. "This is the country, Jem," said the writer. "I like America. There is no despotism here. That's the great thing. Employment of all sorts is going a begging, and wages are capital. You have only to choose a trade, Jem, and be it. I haven't made choice of one yet, but I shall soon. At present I haven't quite made up my mind whether to be a carpenter or a tailor." There was yet another kind of passenger, and but one more, who, in the calm and the light winds, was a constant theme of conversation and observation among us. This was an English sailor, a smart, thorough-built English man-of-war's man, with his hat to his shoes, who was serving in the American navy, and having got leave of absence was on his way home to see his friends. When he presented himself to take and pay for his passage, it had been suggested to him that, being an able seaman, he might as well work it and save the money, but this piece of advice he very indignantly rejected, saying he'd be damned but for once he'd go aboard ship as a gentleman. Accordingly they took his money, but he no sooner came aboard than he stowed his kit in the forecastle, arranged to mess with the crew, and the very first time the hands were turned up, went aloft like a cat before anybody, and all through the passage there he was, first at the braces, outermost on the yards, perpetually lending a hand everywhere, but always with a sober dignity in his manner and a sober grin on his face, which plainly said, "I do it as a gentleman, for my own pleasure, mind you." At length and at last the promised wind came up in right good earnest, and away we went before it, with every stitch of canvas set, slashing through the water nobly. There was a grandeur in the motion of the splendid ship, as, overshadowed by her mass of sails, she rode at a furious pace upon the waves, which filled one with an indescribable sense of pride and exultation. As she plunged into a foaming valley, how I loved to see the green waves, bordered deep with white, come rushing on astern, to buoy her upward at their pleasure, and curl around her as she stooped again, but always own her for their haughty mistress still. On we flew, with changing lights upon the water, being now in the blessed region of fleecy skies, a bright sun lighting us by day, and a bright moon by night, the vane pointing directly homeward, alike the truthful index to the favoring wind and to our cheerful hearts, until at sunrise one fair Monday morning, the 27th of June, I shall not easily forget the day, there lay before us old Cape Clear, God bless it, showing, in the mist of early morning, like a cloud, the brightest and most welcome cloud to us that ever hid the face of heaven's fallen sister, home. Dim speck as it was in the wide prospect, it made the sunrise a more cheerful sight, and gave to it that sort of human interest which it seems to want at sea. There, as elsewhere, the return of day is inseparable from some sense of renewed hope and gladness, but the light shining on the dreary waste of water, and showing it in all its vast extent of loneliness, presents a solemn spectacle, which even night, veiling it in darkness and uncertainty, does not surpass. The rising of the moon is more in keeping with the solitary ocean, and has an air of melancholy grandeur, which in its soft and gentle influence seems to comfort, while it saddens. I recollect when I was a very young child having a fancy that the reflection of the moon in water was a path to heaven, trodden by the spirits of good people on their way to God, and this old feeling often came over me again when I watched it on a tranquil night at sea. The wind was very light on this same Monday morning, but it was still in the right quarter, and so by slow degrees we left Cape Clear behind, and sailed along within sight of the coast of Ireland. And how merry we all were, and how loyal to the George Washington, and how full of mutual congratulations, and how venturesome in predicting the exact hour at which we should arrive at Liverpool, may be easily imagined and readily understood. Also, how heartily we drank the captain's health that day at dinner, and how restless we became about packing up, and how 2 or 3 of the most sanguine spirits rejected the idea of going to bed at all that night, as something it was not worth while to do, so near the shore, but went nevertheless, and slept soundly. And how to be so near our journey's end was like a pleasant dream, from which one feared to wake. The friendly breeze freshened again next day, and on we went once more before it, gallantly, descrying now and then an English ship going homeward under shortened sail, while we, with every inch of canvas crowded on, dashed gaily past, and left her far behind. Towards evening the weather turned hazy, with a drizzling rain, and soon became so thick that we sailed, as it were, in a cloud. Still we swept onward like a phantom ship, and many an eager eye looked up to where the lookout on the mast kept watch for Holyhead. At length his long-expected cry was heard, and at the same moment there shone out from the haze and mist ahead a gleaming light, which presently was gone, and soon returned, and soon was gone again. Whenever it came back, the eyes of all on board brightened and sparkled like itself, and there we all stood, watching this revolving light upon the rock at Holyhead, and praising it for its brightness and its friendly warning, and lauding it, in short, above all other signal lights that ever were displayed, until it once more glimmered faintly in the distance, far behind us. Then it was time to fire a gun for a pilot, and almost before its smoke had cleared away, a little boat with a light at her masthead came bearing down upon us through the darkness, swiftly, and presently, our sails being backed, she ran alongside, and the hoarse pilot, wrapped and muffled in pea-coats and shawls to the very bridge of his water-ploughed-up nose, stood bodily among us on the deck. And I think if that pilot had wanted to borrow £50 for an indefinite period on no security, we should have engaged to lend it to him, among us, before his boat had dropped astern, or, which is the same thing, before every scrap of news in the paper he brought with him had become the common property of all on board. We turned in pretty late that night, and turned out pretty early next morning. By 6 o'clock we clustered on the deck, prepared to go ashore, and looked upon the spires and roofs and smoke of Liverpool. By 8 we all sat down in one of its hotels to eat and drink together for the last time, and by 9 we had shaken hands all round, and broken up our social company forever. The country by the railroad seemed, as we rattled through it, like a luxuriant garden. The beauty of the fields, so small they looked, the hedgerows and the trees, the pretty cottages, the beds of flowers, the old churchyards, the antique houses, and every well-known object, the exquisite delights of that one journey, crowding in the short compass of a summer's day the joy of many years with the winding up with home and all that makes it dear, no tongue can tell, or pen of mine describe. End of section 18.
American Notes by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. American Notes by Charles Dickens. Chapter 17. Slavery. The upholders of slavery in America, of the atrocities of which system I shall not write one word for which I have not had ample proof and warrant, may be divided into three great classes. The first are those more moderate and rational owners of human capital, who have come into the possession of them as so many coins in their trading capital, but who admit the frightful nature of the institution in the abstract, and perceive the dangers to society with which it is fraught. Dangers which, however distant they may be, or howsoever tardy in their coming on, are as certain to fall upon its guilty head as in the day of judgment. The second consists of all those owners, breeders, users, buyers, and sellers of slaves, who will, until the bloody chapter has a bloody end, own, breed, use, buy, and sell them at all hazards, who doggedly deny the horrors of the system in the teeth of such a mass of evidence as never was brought to bear on any other subject, and to which the experience of every day contributes its immense amount, who would at this or any other moment gladly involve America in a war, civil or foreign, provided that it had for its sole end and object the assertion of their right to perpetuate slavery, and to whip and work and torture slaves unquestioned by any human authority, and unassailed by any human power, who, when they speak of freedom, mean the freedom to oppress their kind, and to be savage, merciless, and cruel, and of whom every man, on his own ground in republican America, is a more exacting and a sterner and a less responsible despot than the Caliph Haroun al-Rashid in his angry robe of scarlet. The third, and not the least numerous or influential, is composed of all that delicate gentility which cannot bear a superior, and cannot brook an equal, of that class whose republicanism means, I will not tolerate a man above me, and of those below, none must approach too near; whose pride in a land where voluntary servitude is shunned as a disgrace, must be ministered to by slaves, and whose inalienable rights can only have their growth in negro wrongs. It has been sometimes urged that, in the unavailing efforts which have been made to advance the cause of human freedom in the Republic of America (strange cause for history to treat of), sufficient regard has not been had to the existence of the first class of persons, and it has been contended that they are hardly used in being confounded with the second. This is no doubt the case. Noble instances of pecuniary and personal sacrifice have already had their growth among them, and it is much to be regretted that the gulf between them and the advocates of emancipation should have been widened and deepened by any means; the rather, as there are beyond dispute among these slave owners many kind masters who are tender in their exercise of their unnatural power. Still, it is to be feared that this injustice is inseparable from the state of things with which humanity and truth are called upon to deal. Slavery is not a whit the more endurable because some hearts are to be found which can partially resist its hardening influences, nor can the indignant tide of honest wrath stand still, because on its onward course it overwhelms a few who are comparatively innocent, among a host of the guilty. The ground most commonly taken by these latter men among the advocates of slavery is this: it is a bad system, and for myself I would willingly get rid of it, if I could, most willingly. But it is not so bad as you in England take it to be. You are deceived by the representations of the emancipationists. The greater part of my slaves are much attached to me. You will say that I do not allow them to be severely treated, but I will put it to you whether you believe that it can be a general practice to treat them inhumanly, when it would impair their value, and would be obviously against the interests of their masters. Is it in the interest of any man to steal, to game, to waste his health and mental faculties by drunkenness, to lie, forswear himself, indulge hatred, seek desperate revenge, or do murder? No. All these are roads to ruin. And why then do men tread them? Because such inclinations are among the vicious qualities of mankind. Blot out, ye friends of slavery, from the catalogue of human passions, brutal lust, cruelty, and the abuse of irresponsible power, of all earthly temptations the most difficult to be resisted. And when ye have done so, and not before, we will inquire whether it be the interest of a master to lash and maim the slaves, over whose lives and limbs he has an absolute control. But again, this class, together with the last one I have named, the miserable aristocracy spawned of a false republic, lift up their voices and exclaim, "Public opinion is all sufficient to prevent such cruelty as you denounce." Public opinion? Why, public opinion in the slave states is slavery, is it not? Public opinion in the slave states has delivered the slaves over to the gentle mercies of their masters. Public opinion has made the laws, and denied the slaves legislative protection. Public opinion has knotted the lash, heated the branding iron, loaded the rifle, and shielded the murderer. Public opinion threatens the abolitionist with death if he venture to the South, who drags him with a rope about his middle in broad unblushing noon through the first city in the East. Public opinion has, within a few years, burned a slave alive at a slow fire in the city of St. Louis. And public opinion has to this day maintained upon the bench that estimable judge, who charged the jury, impanelled there to try his murderers, that their most horrid deed was an act of public opinion, and being so, must not be punished by the laws the public sentiment had made. Public opinion hailed this doctrine with a howl of wild applause, and set the prisoners free to walk the city, men of mark and influence and station, as they had been before. Public opinion! What class of men have an immense preponderance over the rest of the community in their power of representing public opinion in the legislature? The slave owners. They send from their 12 states 100 members, while the 14 free states, with a free population nearly double, return but 142. Before whom do the presidential candidates bow down the most humbly? On whom do they fawn the most fondly? And for whose tastes do they cater the most assiduously in their servile protestations? The slave owners always. Public opinion! Here the public opinion of the free South was expressed by its own members in a House of Representatives at Washington. "I have a great respect for the chair," quoth North Carolina. "I have a great respect for the chair as an officer of the House, and great respect for him personally. Nothing but that respect prevents me from rushing to the table and tearing that petition which has just been presented for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia to pieces." "I warn the abolitionists," said South Carolina, "ignorant, infuriated barbarians as they are, that if chance shall throw any of them into our hands, he may expect a felon's death." "Let an abolitionist come within the borders of South Carolina," cried a third mild Carolina's colleague, "and if we can catch him, we will try him, and notwithstanding the interference of all the governments on earth, including the federal government, we will hang him." Public opinion has made this law. It has declared that in Washington, in that city which takes its name from the father of American liberty, any justice of the peace may bind with fetters any negro passing down the street and thrust him into jail. No offence on the black man's part is necessary. The justice says, "I choose to think this man a runaway," and locks him up. Public opinion empowers the man of the law, when this is done, to advertise the negro in the newspapers, warning his owner to come and claim him, or he will be sold to pay the jail fees. But supposing he is a free black, and has no owner, it may naturally be presumed that he is set at liberty. No, he is sold to recompense his jailer. This has been done again and again and again. He has no means of proving his freedom. He has no adviser, messenger, or assistance of any sort or kind. No investigation into his case is made, or inquiries instituted. He, a free man, who may have served for years and bought his liberty, is thrown into jail on no process, for no crime, and on no pretence of crime, and is sold to pay the jail fees. This seems incredible, even of America, but it is the law. Public opinion is deferred to in such cases as the following, which is headed in the newspapers: Interesting Law Case. An interesting case is now on trial in the Supreme Court, arising out of the following facts. A gentleman residing in Maryland had allowed an aged pair of his slaves substantial, though not legal, freedom for several years. While thus living, a daughter was born to them, grew up in the same liberty, until she married a free negro, and went with him to reside in Pennsylvania. They had several children, and lived unmolested until their original owner died, when his heir attempted to regain them, but the magistrate before whom they were brought decided that he had no jurisdiction in the case. The owner seized the woman and her children in the night, and carried them to Maryland. "Cash for Negroes, cash for Negroes, cash for Negroes," is the heading of advertisements in great capitals down the long columns of the crowded journals. Woodcuts of a runaway negro with manacled hands, crouching beneath a bluff pursuer in top boots, who, having caught him, grasps him by the throat, agreeably diversify the pleasant text. The leading article protests against that abominable and hellish doctrine of abolition, which is repugnant alike to every law of God and nature. The delicate mamma, who smiles her acquiescence in this sprightly writing as she reads the paper in her cool piazza, quiets her youngest child who clings about her skirts, by promising the boy a whip to beat the little niggers with. But the negroes, little and big, are protected by public opinion. Let us try this public opinion by another test, which is important in 3 points of view. First, as showing how desperately timid of the public opinion slave owners are, and their delicate descriptions of fugitive slaves in widely circulated newspapers. Secondly, as showing how perfectly contented the slaves are, and how very seldom they run away. Thirdly, as exhibiting their entire freedom from scar or blemish or any mark of cruel infliction, as their pictures are drawn, not by lying abolitionists, but by their own truthful masters. The following are a few specimens of the advertisements in the public papers. It is only 4 years since the oldest among them appeared, and others of the same nature continue to be published every day in shoals. Ran away, negress Caroline, had on a collar with one prong turned down. Ran away, a black woman, Betsy, had an iron bar on her right leg. Ran away, the negro Manuel, much marked with irons. Ran away, the negress Fanny, had on an iron band about her neck. Ran away, a negro boy about 12 years old, had round his neck a chain dog collar with de l'Empire engraved on it. Ran away, the negro Hone, has a ring of iron on his left foot, also Grease, his wife, having a ring and chain on the left leg. Ran away, a negro boy named James. Said boy was ironed when he left me. Committed to jail, a man who calls his name John. He has a clog of iron on his right foot, which will weigh 4 or 5 pounds. Detained at the police jail, the negro wench Myra has several marks of lashing, and has irons on her feet. Ran away, a negro woman and 2 children. A few days before she went off, I burnt her with a hot iron on the left side of her face. I tried to make the letter M. Ran away, a negro named Henry. His left eye out, some scars from a dirk on and under his left arm, and much scarred with the whip. $100 reward for a negro fellow, Pompey, 40 years old. He is branded on the left jaw. Committed to jail, a negro man, has no toes on the left foot. Ran away, a negro woman named Rachel, has lost all her toes except the large one. Ran away, Sam. He was shot a short time since through the hand, and has several shots in his left arm and side. Ran away, my negro man Dennis. Said negro has been shot in the left arm between the shoulder and elbow, which has paralyzed the left hand. Ran away, my negro man named Simon. He's been shot badly in his back and right arm. Ran away, a negro named Arthur. Has a considerable scar across his breast and each arm, made by a knife. Loves to talk much of the goodness of God. $25 reward for my man Isaac. He has a scar on his forehead caused by a blow, and one on his back made by a shot from a pistol. Ran away, a negro girl called Mary. Has a small scar over her eye, a good many teeth missing. The letter A is branded on her cheek and forehead. Ran away, negro Ben. Has a scar on his right hand. His thumb and forefinger being injured by being shot last fall. A part of the bone came out. He has also one or two large scars on his back and hips. Detained at the jail, a mulatto named Tom. Has a scar on the right cheek and appears to have been burned with powder on the face. Ran away, a negro man named Ned. 3 of his fingers are drawn into the palm of his hand by a cut. Has a scar on the back of his neck, nearly half round, done by a knife. Was committed to jail, a negro man. Says his name is Josiah. His back very much scarred by the whip and branded on the thigh and hips in 3 or 4 places. Thus, J.M. The rim of his right ear has been bit or cut off. $50 reward for my fellow Edward. He has a scar on the corner of his mouth, 2 cuts on and under his arm, and the letter E on his arm. Run away, negro boy Ellie. Has a scar on one of his arms from the bite of a dog. Ran away from the plantation of James Surgette. The following are negroes. Randall has 1 ear cropped. Bob has lost 1 eye. Kentucky Tom has 1 jaw broken. Ran away, Anthony. 1 of his ears cut off, and his left hand cut with an axe. $50 reward for the negro Jim Blake. Has a piece cut out of each ear, and the middle finger of the left hand cut off to the second joint. Ran away, a negro woman named Maria. Has a scar on one side of her cheek by a cut. Some scars on her back. Ran away, the mulatto wench Mary. Has a cut on the left arm, a scar on the left shoulder, and 2 upper teeth missing. I should say, perhaps in explanation of this latter piece of description, that among the other blessings which public opinion secures to the negroes is the common practice of violently punching out their teeth. To make them wear iron collars by day and night, and to worry them with dogs, are practices almost too ordinary to deserve mention. Ran away, my man Fountain. Has holes in his ears, a scar on the right side of his forehead, has been shot in the hind parts of his legs, and is marked on the back with the whip. $250 reward for my negro man Jim. He is much marked with shot in his right thigh. The shot entered on the outside, halfway between the hip and the knee joints. Brought to jail, John. Left ear cropped. Taken up, a negro man. Is very much scarred about the face and body, and has the left ear bit off. Ran away, a black girl named Mary. Has a scar on her cheek, and the end of one of her toes cut off. Ran away, my mulatto woman Judy. She has had her right arm broke. Ran away, my negro man Levi. His left hand has been burnt, and I think the end of his forefinger is off. Ran away, a negro man named Washington. Has lost a part of his middle finger, and the end of his little finger. $25 reward for my man John. The tip of his nose is bit off. $25 reward for the negro slave Sally. Walks as though crippled in the back. Ran away, Joe Dennis. Has a small notch in one of his ears. Ran away, negro boy Jack. Has a small crop out of his left ear. Ran away, a negro man named Ivory. Has a small piece cut out of the top of each ear. While upon the subject of ears, I may observe that a distinguished abolitionist in New York once received a negro's ear, which had been cut off close to the head, in a general post letter. It was forwarded by the free and independent gentleman who had caused it to be amputated, with a polite request that he would place the specimen in his collection. I could enlarge this catalogue with broken arms and broken legs, and gashed flesh, and missing teeth, and lacerated backs, and bites of dogs, and brands of red-hot irons, innumerable. But as my readers will be sufficiently sickened and repelled already, I will turn to another branch of the subject. These advertisements, of which a similar collection might be made for every year, and month, and week, and day, and which are coolly read in families as things of course, and as a part of the current news and small talk, will serve to show how very much the slaves profit by public opinion, and how tender it is in their behalf. But it may be worth while to inquire how the slave owners, and the class of society to which great numbers of them belong, defer to public opinion in their conduct, not to their slaves, but to each other. How they are accustomed to restrain their passions, what their bearing is among themselves, whether they are fierce or gentle, whether their social customs be brutal, sanguinary, and violent, or bear the impress of civilization and refinement. That we may have no partial evidence from abolitionists in this inquiry, either, I will once more turn to their own newspapers, and I will confine myself this time to a selection from paragraphs which appeared from day to day during my visit to America, and which refer to occurrences happening while I was there. The italics in these extracts, as in the foregoing, are my own. These cases did not all occur, it will be seen, in the territory actually belonging to legalized slave states, though most, and those the very worst among them, did, as their counterparts constantly do. But the position of the scenes of action in reference to places immediately at hand, where slavery is the law, and the strongest resemblance between that class of outrages and the rest, lead to the just presumption that the character of the parties concerned was formed in slave districts and brutalized by slave customs. Horrible tragedy. By a slip from the Southport Telegraph, Wisconsin, we learn that the Honorable Charles C.P. Arndt, member of the Council for Brown County, was shot dead on the floor of the council chamber by James R. Vineyard, member from Grant County. The affair grew out of a nomination for sheriff of Grant County. Mr. E. S. Baker was nominated and supported by Mr. Arndt. This nomination was opposed by Vineyard, who wanted the appointment to rest in his own brother. In the course of debate, the deceased made some statements which Vineyard pronounced false, and made use of violent and insulting language, dealing largely in personalities, to which Mr. A. made no reply. After the adjournment, Mr. A. stepped up to Vineyard and requested him to retract, which he refused to do, repeating the offensive words. Mr. Arndt then made a blow at Vineyard, who stepped back a pace, drew a pistol, and shot him dead. The issue appears to have been provoked on the part of Vineyard, who was determined at all hazards to defeat the appointment of Baker, and who, himself defeated, turned his ire and revenge upon the unfortunate Arndt. The Wisconsin tragedy. Public indignation runs high in the territory of Wisconsin in relation to the murder of C.C.P. Arndt in the legislative hall of the territory. Meetings have been held in different counties of Wisconsin, denouncing the practice of secretly bearing arms in the legislative chambers of the country. We have seen the account of the expulsion of James R. Vineyard, the perpetrator of the bloody deed, and are amazed to hear that, after this expulsion by those who saw Vineyard kill Mr. Arndt in the presence of his aged father, who was on a visit to see his son, little dreaming that he was to witness his murder, Judge Dunn has discharged Vineyard on bail. The Miners' Free Press speaks in terms of merited rebuke at the outrage upon the feelings of the people of Wisconsin. Vineyard was within arm's length of Mr. Arndt, when he took such deadly aim at him that he never spoke. Vineyard might at pleasure, being so near, have only wounded him, but he chose to kill him. Murder. By a letter in a St. Louis paper of the 14th, we noticed a terrible outrage at Burlington, Iowa. A Mr. Bridgman, having had a difficulty with a citizen of the place, Mr. Ross, A brother-in-law of the latter provided himself with one of Colt's revolving pistols, met Mr. B. in the street, and discharged the contents of 5 of the barrels at him, each shot taking effect. Mr. B., though horribly wounded and dying, returned the fire, and killed Ross on the spot. Terrible death of Robert Potter. From the Caddo Gazette of the 12th inst. We learn the frightful death of Colonel Robert Potter. He was beset in his house by an enemy named Rose. He sprang from his couch, seized his gun, and in his night clothes rushed from the house. For about 200 yards his speed seemed to defy his pursuers, but getting entangled in a thicket he was captured. Rose told him that he intended to act a generous part, and give him a chance for his life. He then told Potter he might run, and he should not be interrupted until he reached a certain distance. Potter started at the word of command, and before a gun was fired he had reached the lake. His first impulse was to jump in the water and dive for it, which he did. Rose was close behind him, and formed his men on the bank, ready to shoot him as he rose. In a few seconds he came up to breathe, and scarce had his head reached the surface of the water, when it was completely riddled with the shots of their guns, and he sank, to rise no more. Murder in Arkansas. We understand that a severe reconnoitre came off a few days since in the Seneca Nation, between Mr. Luce, the sub-agent of the mixed band of the Senecas, Quapaw, and Shawnees, and Mr. James Gillespie, of the mercantile firm of Thomas G. Alisson and Co., of Maysville, Benton County, Arkansas, in which the latter was slain with a bowie knife. Some difficulty had for some time existed between the parties. It is said that Major Gillespie brought on the attack with a cane. A severe conflict ensued, during which 2 pistols were fired by Gillespie, and 1 by Luce. Luce then stabbed Gillespie with one of those never-failing weapons, a bowie knife. The death of Major G. is much regretted, since he was a liberal-minded and energetic man. Since the above was in type, we have learned that Major Alisson has stated to some of our citizens in town that Mr. Luce gave the first blow. We forbear to give any particulars, as the matter will be the subject of judicial investigation. Foul deed. The steamer Thames, just from Missouri River, brought us a handbill offering a reward of $500 for the person who assassinated Lilburn W. Baggs, late governor of this state, at Independence, on the night of the 6th inst. Governor Baggs, it is stated in a written memorandum, was not dead, but mortally wounded. Since the above was written, we received a note from the clerks of the Thames, giving the following particulars. Governor Baggs was shot by some villain on Friday, 6 inst. In the evening, while sitting in a room in his own house in Independence. His son, a boy, hearing a report, ran into the room, and found the governor sitting in his chair with his jaw fallen down and his head leaning back. On discovering the injury done to his father, he gave the alarm. Foot tracks were found in the garden below the window, and a pistol picked up, supposed to have been overloaded, and thrown from the hand of the scoundrel who fired it. 3 buck-shots of a heavy load took effect, one going through his mouth, one into the brain, and another probably in or near the brain, all going into the back part of the neck and head. The governor was still alive on the morning of the 7th, but no hopes for his recovery by his friends, and but slight hopes from the physicians. A man was suspected, and the sheriff most probably had possession of him by this time. The pistol was one in a pair, stolen some days previous from a baker in Independence, and the legal authorities have the description of the other. Rencontre. An unfortunate affair took place on Friday evening in Chatt Street, in which one of our most respectable citizens received a dangerous wound from a poniard in the abdomen. From the Bee, New Orleans, of yesterday, we learn the following particulars. It appears that an article was published in the French side of the paper on Monday last, containing some strictures on the artillery battalion for firing their guns on Sunday morning, in answer to those from the Ontario and Woodbury, and thereby much alarm was caused to the families of the persons who were out all night. preserving the peace of the city. Major C. Galley, commander of the battalion, resenting this, called at the office and demanded the author's name. That of Mr. P. Arpin was given to him, who was absent at the time. Some angry words then passed with one of the proprietors, and a challenge followed. The friends of both parties tried to arrange the affair, but failed to do so. On Friday evening, about 7 o'clock, Major Galley met Mr. P. Arpin in Chatres Street, and accosted him. "Are you Mr. Arpin?" "Yes, sir." "Then I have to tell you that you are applying an appropriate epithet." "I shall remind you of your words, sir." "But I have said I would break my cane on your shoulders." "I know it, but I have not yet received the blow." At these words Major Galley, having a cane in his hand, struck Mr. Arpin across the face, and the latter drew a poniard from his pocket and stabbed Major Galley in the abdomen. Fears are entertained that the wound will be mortal. We understand that Mr. Arpin has given security for his appearance at the criminal court to answer the charge. A fray in Mississippi. On the 27th ult., in an affray near Carthage, Leake County, Mississippi, between the James Cottingham and John Wilburn, the latter was shot by the former, and so horribly wounded that there was no hope of his recovery. On the 2nd instant, there was an affray at Carthage between A. C. Sharkey and George Goff, in which the latter was shot and thought mortally wounded. Sharkey delivered himself up to the authorities, but changed his mind and escaped. Personal encounter. An encounter took place in Sparta, a few days since, between the barkeeper of an hotel and a man named Bury. It appears that Bury had become somewhat noisy, and that the barkeeper, determined to preserve order, had threatened to shoot Bury, whereupon Bury drew a pistol and shot the barkeeper down. He was not dead at the last accounts, but slight hopes were entertained of his recovery. Duel. The clerk of the Steamboat Tribune informs us that another duel was fought on Tuesday last by Mr. Robbins, a bank officer in Vicksburg, and Mr. Fall, the editor of the Vicksburg Sentinel. According to the arrangement, the parties had 6 pistols each, which, after the word "fire," they were to discharge as fast as they pleased. Fall fired 2 pistols without effect. Mr. Robbins' first shot took effect in Fall's thigh, who fell and was unable to continue the combat. Affray in Clark County. An unfortunate affray occurred in Clark County, Missouri, near Waterloo, on Tuesday the 19th ult., which originated in settling the partnership concerns of Messrs. McCain and McAllister, who had been engaged in the business of distilling, and resulted in the death of the latter, who was shot down by Mr. McCain because of his attempting to take possession of several barrels of whisky, the property of McCain, which had been knocked off to McAllister at a sheriff's sale at $1 per barrel. McCain immediately fled, and at the latest dates had not been taken. This unfortunate affray caused considerable excitement in the neighbourhood, as both the parties were men with large families depending upon them, and stood well in the community. I will quote but one more paragraph, which, by reason of its monstrous absurdity, may be a relief to these atrocious deeds. Affair of Honour. We have just heard the particulars of a meeting which took place on 6 Mile Island, on Tuesday, between 2 young bloods of our city, Samuel Thurston, aged 15, and William Hine, aged 13. They were attended by young gentlemen of the same age. The weapons used on the occasion were a couple of DICKENS best rifles, the distance 30 yards. They took one fire, without any damage being sustained by either party, except the ball of Thurston's gun passing through the crown of Hines's hat. Through the intercession of the Board of Honour, the challenge was withdrawn, and the difference amicably adjusted. If the reader will picture to himself the kind of Board of Honour which amicably adjusted the difference between these 2 little boys, who in any other part of the world would have been amicably adjusted on 2 porters' backs and soundly flogged with birchen rods, he will be possessed, no doubt, with the strongest sense of its ludicrous character, as that which sets me laughing whenever its image rises up before me. Now I appeal to every human mind imbued with the commonest of common sense, and the commonest of common humanity, to all dispassionate reasoning creatures of any shade of opinion, and ask, with these revolting evidences of the state of society which exists in and about the slave districts of America before them, can they have a doubt of the real condition of the slave, or can they for a moment make a compromise between the institution or any of its flagrant, fearful features and their own just consciences? Will they say of any tale of cruelty and horror, however aggravated in degree, that it is improbable, when they can turn to these public prints, and, running, read such signs as these laid before them by the men who rule the slaves, as in their own acts and under their own hands? Do we not know that the worst deformity and ugliness of slavery are at once the cause and effect of the reckless license taken by these free-born outlaws? Do we not know that the man who has been born and bred among its wrongs, who has seen in his childhood husbands obliged at the word of command to flog their wives, women indecently compelled to hold up their own garments that men might lay their heavier stripes upon their legs, driven and harried by brutal overseers in their time of travail, and becoming mothers on the field of toil under the very lash itself, who has read in youth and seen his virgin sisters read descriptions of runaway men and women, and their disfigured persons, which could not be published elsewhere, of so much stock upon a farm, or at a show of beasts? Do we not know that that man, whenever his wrath is kindled up, will be a brutal savage? Do we not know that as he is a coward in his domestic life, stalking among his shrinking men and women slaves, armed with his heavy whip, so he will be a coward out of doors, and carrying cowards' weapons hidden in his breast, will shoot men down and stab them when he quarrels? And if our reason did not teach us this and much beyond, if we were such idiots as to close our eyes to that fine mode of training which rears up such men, should we not know that they who among their equals stab and pistol in the legislative halls, and in the counting house, and on the market-place, and in all the elsewhere peaceful pursuits of life, must be to their dependents, even though they were free servants, so many merciless and unrelenting tyrants? What! Shall we declaim against the ignorant peasantry of Ireland, and mince the matter when these American taskmasters are in question? Shall we cry shame on the brutality of those who hamstring cattle, and spare the lights of freedom upon earth; who notch the ears of men and women, cut pleasant posies in the shrinking flesh, learn to write with pens of red-hot iron on the human face, rack their poetic fancies for liveries and mutilation which their slaves shall wear for life and carry to the grave, breaking living limbs, as did the soldiery who mocked and slew the Saviour of the world, and set defenceless creatures up for targets? Shall we whimper over legends of the tortures practised on each other by the pagan Indians, and smile upon the cruelties of Christian men? Shall we, so long as these things last, exult above the scattered remnants of that race, and triumph in the white enjoyment of their possessions? Rather, for me, restore the forest and the Indian village. In lieu of stars and stripes, let some poor feather flutter in the breeze. Replace the streets and squares by wigwams, and though the death song of 100 haughty warriors fill the air, it will be music to the shriek of one unhappy slave. On one theme, which is commonly before our eyes, and in respect of which our national character is changing fast, let the plain truth be spoken, and let us not, like dastards, beat about the bush by hinting at the Spaniard and the fierce Italian. When knives are drawn by Englishmen in conflict, let it be said and known, we owe this change of republican slavery. These are the weapons of freedom. With sharp points and edges such as these, liberty in America hews and hacks her slaves, or, failing that pursuit, her sons devote them to a better use, and turn them on each other. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of American Notes by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. American Notes by Charles Dickens. Chapter 18. Concluding Remarks. There are many passages in this book where I have been at some pains to resist the temptation of troubling my readers with my own deductions and conclusions, preferring that they should judge for themselves, for such premises as I have laid before them. My only object in the outset was, to carry them with me faithfully wheresoever I went, and that task I have discharged. But I may be pardoned, if on such a theme as the general character of the American people, and the general character of their social system, as presented to a stranger's eyes, I desire to express my own opinions in a few words, before I bring these volumes to a close. They are by nature frank, brave, cordial, hospitable, and affectionate. Cultivation and refinement seem but to enhance their warmth of heart and ardent enthusiasm, and it is the possession of these latter qualities in a most remarkable degree, which renders an educated American one of the most endearing and most generous of friends. I never was so won upon as by this class, never yielded up my full confidence and esteem so readily and pleasurably as to them, never can make again in half a year so many friends for whom I seem to entertain the regard of half a life. These qualities are natural, I implicitly believe, to the whole people, that they are indeed sadly sapped and blighted in their growth among the mass, and that there are influences at work which endanger them still more, and give but little present promise of their healthy restoration, is a truth that ought to be told. It is an essential part of every national character to pique itself mightily upon its faults, and to deduce tokens of its virtue or its wisdom from their very exaggeration. One great blemish in the popular mind of America, and the prolific parent of an innumerable brood of evils, is universal distrust. Yet the American citizen plumes himself upon this spirit, even when he is sufficiently dispassionate to perceive the ruin it works, and will often adduce it, in spite of his own reason, as an instance of the great sagacity and acuteness of the people, and their superior shrewdness and independence. You carry, says the stranger, this jealousy and distrust into every transaction of public life. By repelling worthy men from your legislative assemblies, it has bred up a class of candidates for the suffrage who, in their every act, disgrace your institutions and your people's choice. It has rendered you so fickle, and so given to change, that your inconstancy has passed into a proverb. But you no sooner set up an idol firmly, than you are sure to pull it down and dash it into fragments. And this, because directly you reward a benefactor or a public servant, you distrust him merely because he is rewarded, and immediately apply yourself to find out either that you have been too bountiful in your acknowledgments, or he remiss in his deserts. Any man who attains a high place among you, from the President downwards, may date his downfall from that moment. For any printed lie that any notorious villain pens, although it militate directly against the character and conduct of a life, appeals at once to your distrust, and is believed. You will strain at a gnat in the way of trustfulness and confidence, however fairly won and well deserved, but you will swallow a whole caravan of camels, if they be laden with unworthy doubts and mean suspicions. Is this well, think you, or likely to elevate the character of the governors or the governed among you? The answer is invariably the same. There's freedom of opinion here, you know. Every man thinks for himself, and we are not to be easily overreached. That's how our people come to be suspicious. Another prominent feature is the love of smart dealing, which gilds over many a swindle and gross breach of trust, many a defalcation, public and private, and many a knave to hold his head up with the best, who well deserve a halter, though it has not been without its retributive operation. For this smartness has done more in a few years to impair the public credit, and to cripple the public resources, than dull honesty, however rash, could have effected in a century. The merits of a broken speculation, or a bankruptcy, or of a successful scoundrel, are not gauged by its or his observance of the golden rule, do as you would be done by, but are considered with reference to their smartness. I recollect, on both occasions of our passing that ill-fated Cairo on the Mississippi, remarking on the bad effects such gross deceits must have when they exploded, in generating a want of confidence abroad, and discouraging investment. For that I was given to understand that this was a very smart scheme by which the deal of money had been made, and that its smartest feature was, that they forgot these things abroad in a very short time, and speculated again as freely as ever. The following dialogue I have held 100 times. Is it not a very disgraceful circumstance that such a man as so-and-so should be acquiring a large property by the most infamous and odious means, and notwithstanding all the crimes of which he has been guilty, should be tolerated and abetted by your citizens? He is a public nuisance, is he not? Yes, sir. A convicted liar? Yes, sir. He has been kicked and cuffed and caned? Yes, sir. And he is utterly dishonourable, debased, and profligate? Yes, sir. In the name of wonder, then, what is his merit? Well, sir, he is a smart man. In like manner, all kinds of deficient and impolitic usages are referred to the national love of trade, though oddly enough it would be a weighty charge against a foreigner that he regarded the Americans as a trading people. The love of trade is assigned as a reason for that comfortable custom, so very prevalent in country towns, of married persons living in hotels, having no fireside of their own, and seldom meeting from early morning until late at night, but at the hasty public meals. The love of trade is a reason why the literature of America is to remain for ever unprotected. For we are a trading people, and don't care for poetry. Though we do, by the way, profess to be very proud of our poets, while healthful amusements, cheerful means of recreation, and wholesome fancies must fade before the stern utilitarian joys of trade. These three characteristics are strongly presented at every turn full in the stranger's view. But the foul growth of America has a more tangled root than this, and it strikes its fibres deep in its licentious press. Schools may be erected, east, west, north, and south, pupils be taught, and masters reared by scores upon scores of thousands. Colleges may thrive, churches may be crammed, temperance may be diffused, and advancing knowledge in all other forms walk through the land with great strides. But while the newspaper press of America is in or near its present abject state, high moral improvement in that country is hopeless. Year by year it must and will go back. Year by year the tone of public feeling must sink lower down. Year by year the Congress and the Senate must become of less account before all decent men. And year by year the memory of the great fathers of the Revolution must be outraged more and more in the bad life of their degenerate child. Among the herd of journals which are published in the States, there are some, the reader scarcely need be told, of character and credit. From personal intercourse with accomplished gentlemen connected with publications of this class, I have derived both pleasure and profit. But the name of these is few, and of the others legion, and the influence of the good is powerless to counteract the moral poison of the bad. Among the gentry of America, among the well-informed and moderate, in the learned professions, at the bar and on the bench, there is, as there can be, but one opinion in reference to the vicious character of these infamous journals. It is sometimes contended, I will not say strangely, for it is nature to seek excuses for such a disgrace, that their influence is not so great as a visitor would suppose. I must be pardoned for saying that there is no warrant for this plea, and that every fact and circumstance tends directly to the opposite conclusion. When any man of any grade of desert in intellect or character can climb to any public distinction, no matter what, in America, without first grovelling down upon the earth, and bending the knee before this monster of depravity, when any private excellence is safe from its attacks, when any social confidence is left unbroken by it, or any tie of social decency and honour is held in the least regard, when any man in that free country has freedom of opinion, and presumes to think for himself, and speak for himself, without humble reference to a censorship which, for its rampant ignorance and based on dishonesty, he utterly loathes and despises in his heart; when those who most acutely feel its infamy and the reproach it casts upon the nation, and who most denounce it to each other, dare to set their heels upon and crush it openly in the sight of all men, then I will believe that its influence is lessening, and men are returning to their manly senses. But while that press has its evil eye in every house, and its black hand in every appointment in the state, from a president to a postman, while, with ribald slander for its only stock in trade, it is the standard literature of an enormous class, who must find their reading in a newspaper, or they will not read at all, so long must its odium be upon the country's head, and so long must the evil it works be plainly visible in the Republic. To those who are accustomed to the leading English journals, or to the respectable journals of the continent of Europe, to those who are accustomed to anything else in print and paper, it would be impossible, without an amount of extract for which I have neither space nor inclination, to convey an adequate idea of this frightful engine in America. But if any man desire confirmation of my state on this head, let him repair to any place in the city of London where scattered numbers of these publications are to be found, and there let him form his own opinion. It would be well, there can be no doubt, for the American people as a whole, if they loved the real less, and the ideal somewhat more. It would be well if there were greater encouragement to lightness of heart and gaiety, and a wider cultivation of what is beautiful, without being eminently and directly useful. But here I think the general remonstrance, "We are a new country," which is so often advanced as an excuse for defects which are quite unjustifiable, as being of right only the slow growth of an old one, may be very reasonably argued; and I yet hope to hear of there being some other national amusement in the United States, besides newspaper politics. They certainly are not a humorous people, and their temperament always impressed me as being of a dull and gloomy character. In shrewdness of remark, and a certain cast-iron quaintness, the Yankees, or people of New England, unquestionably take the lead, as they do in most other evidences of intelligence. But in travelling about, out of the large cities, as I have remarked in former parts of these volumes, I was quite oppressed by the prevailing seriousness and melancholy air of business, which was so general and unvarying, that at every new town I came to, I seemed to meet the very same people whom I had left behind me at the last. Such defects as are perceptible in the national manners seem to me to be referable, in a great degree, to this cause, which has generated a dull, sullen persistence in coarse usage, and rejected the graces of life as undeserving of attention. There is no doubt that Washington, who was always most scrupulous and exact on points of ceremony, perceived the tendency towards this mistake, even in his time, and did his utmost to correct it. I cannot hold with other writers on these subjects that the prevalence of various forms of dissent in America is in any way attributable to the non-existence there of an established church. Indeed, I think the temper of the people, if it admitted of such an institution being founded amongst them, would lead them to desert it as a matter of course, merely because it was established. But supposing it to exist, I doubt its probable efficacy in summoning the wandering sheep to one great fold, simply because of the immense amount of dissent which prevails at home, and because I do not find in America any one form of religion with which we in Europe, or even in England, are unacquainted. Dissenters resort thither in great numbers, as other people do, simply because it is a land of resort, and great settlements of them are founded because ground can be purchased and towns and villages reared, where there were none of the human creation before. But even the Shakers emigrated from England. Our country is not unknown to Mr. Joseph Smith, the apostle of Mormonism, or to his benighted disciples. I have beheld religious scenes myself in some of our populous towns, which can hardly be surpassed by any American camp meeting, and I am not aware that any instance of superstitious imposture on the one hand, and superstitious credulity on the other, has had its origin in the United States, which we cannot more than parallel by the precedents of Mrs. Southcote, Mary Tofts the rabbit breeder, or even Mrs. Thom of Canterbury, which latter case arose some time after the dark ages had passed away. The republican institutions of America undoubtedly led the people to assert their self-respect and their equality, but a traveller is bound to bear those institutions in his mind, and not hastily to resent the near approach of a class of strangers, who at home would keep aloof. This characteristic, when it was tinctured with no foolish pride, and stopped short of no honest service, never offended me, and I am very seldom, if ever, experienced its rude or unbecoming display. Once or twice it was comically developed, as in the following case, but this was an amusing incident, and not the rule or near it. I wanted a pair of boots at a certain town, for I had none to travel in but those with the memorable cork soles, which were much too hot for the fiery decks of a steamboat. I therefore sent a message to an artist in boots, importing with my compliments that I should be happy to see him, if he would do me the polite favour to call. He very kindly returned answer that he would look round at 6 o'clock that evening. I was lying on the sofa with a book and a wine-glass at about that time, when the door opened, and a gentleman in a stiff cravat, within a year or two of either side of 30, entered, in his hat and gloves, walked up to the looking-glass, arranged his hair, took off his gloves, slowly produced a measure from the utmost depth of his coat pocket, and requested me in a languid tone to unfix my straps. I complied, but looked with some curiosity at his hat, which was still upon his head. It might have been that, or it might have been the heat, but he took it off. Then he sat himself down in a chair opposite me, rested an arm on each knee, and, leaning forward very much, took from the ground, by a great effort, the specimen of metropolitan workmanship which I had just pulled off, whistling pleasantly as he did so. He turned it over and over, surveyed it with a contempt no language can express, and inquired if I wished him to fix me a boot like that. I courteously replied that provided the boots were large enough, I would leave the rest to him; that if convenient and practicable, I should not object to their bearing some resemblance to the model then given before him, but that I would be entirely guided by, and would not beg to leave the whole subject to, his judgment and discretion. "You ain't particular about the scoop in the heel, I suppose, then?" says he. "We don't foller that here." I repeated my last observation. He looked at himself in the glass again, went closer to it to dash a grain or two of dust out of the corner of his eye, and settled his cravat. All this time my leg and foot were in the air. "Nearly ready, sir?" I inquired. "Well, pretty nigh," he said. "Keep steady." I kept as steady as I could, both in foot and face, and having by this time got the dust out, and found his pencil case, he measured me and made the necessary notes. When he had finished, he fell into his old attitude, and taking up the boot again, mused for some time. "And this," he said at last, "is an English boot, is it? This is an English boot, huh?" "That, sir," I replied, "is a London boot." "And this," he said at last, "is an English boot, is it? This is a London boot, eh?" "That, sir," I replied, "is a London boot." He mused over it again, after the manner of Hamlet with Yorick's skull, nodding his head, as who should say, "I pity the institutions that led to the production of this boot," rose, put up his pencil, notes, and paper, glancing at himself in the glass all the time, put on his hat, drew on his gloves very slowly, and finally walked out. When he had been gone about a minute, the door reopened, and his hat and head reappeared. He looked around the room, and at the boot again, which was still lying on the floor, appeared thoughtful for a minute, and then said, "Well, good arternoon." "Good afternoon, sir," said I. And that was the end of the interview. There is but one other head on which I wish to offer a remark, and that has reference to the public health. In so vast a country, where there are thousands of millions of acres of land yet unsettled and uncleared, and on every rood of which vegetable decomposition is annually taking place, where there are so many great rivers, and such opposite varieties of climate, there cannot fail to be a great amount of sickness at certain seasons. But I may venture to say, after conversing with many members of the medical profession in America, that I am not singular in the opinion that much of the disease which does prevail might be avoided if a few common precautions were observed. Greater means of personal cleanliness are indispensable to this end. The custom of hastily swallowing large quantities of animal food 3 times a day, and rushing back to sedentary pursuits after each meal, must be changed. The gentler sex must go more wisely clad, and take more healthful exercise, and in the latter clause the males must be inclined also. Above all, in public institutions, and throughout the whole of every town and city, the system of ventilation and drainage and removal of impurities requires to be thoroughly revised. There is no local legislature in America which may not study Mr. Chadwick's excellent report on the sanitary condition of our labouring classes, with immense advantage. I have now arrived at the end of this book. I have little reason to believe, from certain warnings I have had since I returned to England, that it will be tenderly or favourably received by the American people. And as I have written the truth in relation to the mass of those who form their judgments and express their opinions, it will be seen that I have no desire to court, by any adventitious means, the popular applause. It is enough for me to know that what I have set down in these pages cannot cost me a single friend on the other side of the Atlantic who is in anything deserving of the name. For the rest, I put my trust, implicitly, in the spirit in which they have been conceived and penned, and I can bide my time. I have made no reference to my reception, nor have I suffered it to influence me in what I have written. For in either case I should have offered but a sorry acknowledgment, compared with that I bear within my breast, towards those partial readers of my former books across the water, who met me with an open hand, and not with one that closed upon an iron muzzle. The End. Postscript of American Notes by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. American Notes by Charles Dickens. Postscript. At a public dinner given to me on Saturday, the 18th of April, 1868, in the city of New York, by 200 representatives of the press of the United States of America, I made the following observations among them. So much of my voice has lately been heard in the land, that I might have been contented with troubling you no further from my present standing point, were it not a duty with which I henceforth charge myself, not only here, but on every suitable occasion, whatsoever and wheresoever, to express my high and grateful sense of my second reception in America, and to bear my honest testimony to the national generosity and magnanimity. Also, to declare how astounded I have been by the amazing changes I have seen around me on every side, changes moral, changes physical, changes in the amount of land subdued and peopled, changes in the rise of vast new cities, changes in the growth of older cities almost out of recognition, changes in the graces and amenities of life, changes in the press, without whose advancement no advancement can take place anywhere. Nor am I, believe me, so arrogant as to suppose that in 25 years there have been no changes in me, and that I have nothing to learn, and no extreme impressions to correct when I was here first. And this brings me to a point on which I have, ever since I landed in the United States last November, observed a strict silence, though sometimes tempted to break it, but in reference to which I will, with your good leave, take you into my confidence now. Even the press, being human, may be sometimes mistaken or misinformed, and I rather think that I have, in one or two rare instances, observed its information to be not strictly accurate with reference to myself. Indeed, I have now and again been more surprised by printed news that I have read of myself than by any printed news that I have ever read in my present state of existence. Thus the vigour and perseverance with which I have for some months past been collecting materials for, and hammering away at, a new book on America has much astonished me, seeing that all that time my declaration has been perfectly well known to my publishers on both sides of the Atlantic, that no consideration on earth would induce me to write one. But what I have intended, what I have resolved upon, and this is the confidence I seek to place in you, is, on my return to England, in my own person, in my own journal, to bear, for the behoof of my countrymen, such testimony to their gigantic changes in this country as I have hinted at tonight. Also, to record that whenever I have been, in the smallest places equally with the largest, I have been received with unsurpassable politeness, delicacy, sweet temper, hospitality, consideration, and with unsurpassable respect for the privacy daily enforced upon me by the nature of my avocation here and the state of my health. This testimony, so long as I live, and so long as my descendants have any legal right in my books, I shall cause to be republished as an appendix to every copy of those 2 books of mine in which I have referred to America, and this I will do and cause to be done, not in mere love and thankfulness, but because I regard it as an act of plain justice and honour. I said these words with the greatest earnestness that I could lay upon them, and I repeat them in print here with equal earnestness. So long as this book shall last, I hope that they will form a part of it, and will be fairly read as inseparable from my experiences and impressions of America. Charles Dickens, May, 1868. End of American Notes for General Circulation by Charles Dickens.